not intent on succeeding at all costs. You can't possibly sell out because there's nothing to receive in exchange. So why not do anything you want to, any way you want to? So we had a freedom that most bands deny themselves because they're trying to make it. They're trying to do something. And we were trying to do something too, but we didn't care if it never got out the 4 walls that we were in.
Hey everybody, it's your friend and humble narrator, Cam Forrester. It's been over 2 years since the release of my self-produced documentary Foundation Velvet, The Drumming of Maureen Mo Tucker, and as many of you know, my YouTube channel has come a long way since then. Since the documentary proved to be of interest to so many of you, along with the several other Velvets-related tutorials and covers I've subsequently released, such as All Tomorrow's Parties, Sister Ray, and A Symphony of Sound, I decided that it was time to start working on my next documentary film project. The subject of this new film is Sterling Morrison, guitarist of the Velvet Underground. Sterling without question has been the most overlooked founding member of the group historically and deserves to have his important contributions analysed in a documentary film. Born in East Meadow, Long Island in 1942 and later growing up in Levittown, a recently built suburban housing development, as one of 6 children in a middle-class Catholic family of Scottish ancestry, Holmes Sterling Morrison's beginnings in life were ordinary and unremarkable, much like his future Velvets colleague and Levittown neighbour Maureen Tucker, who he met at the age of 12 through her brother Jim. He was a bright boy who had a keen interest in both literature and music. As a hobby, he began studying trumpet between the ages of 7 to 12 until his teacher got drafted into the military. In spite of his evident promise on the instrument, he decided to switch to the guitar, inspired by the guitarists Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry.
If my parents had owned a piano, then I would have lived happily ever after as a keyboardist because I like polyphonic music. I didn't like the trumpet for that reason. You can only do one thing in a given moment. That might have led me in the way I approached the guitar. That was never a popular decision at home, even if I bought my own instruments and amps. It was always considered a colossal waste of time and leading me to juvenile delinquency. But I was already there, so I couldn't blame that on guitar playing.
Though it transpired that Sterling later became a member of one of the most influential rock bands of his generation, he was not an innovator and had no desire to be. Even though he was a more technically proficient guitar player than his bandmate Lou Reed, Sterling took a deliberately minimalist approach to his instrument. He left spontaneous experimentation to Lou and John and contributed thoughtfully to the overall sound, understanding precisely how to facilitate and bring out the best in it, whether backing up Lou's frenzied guitar solos, providing bass underneath John's manic viola screeches, or riffing and soloing gleefully on guitar if he felt like it. In 1965, most budding guitarists would have run a mile after hearing Lou Reed's risque lyrics or John Cale's avant-garde musical ideas, but Sterling had foresight enough to hear then what we all hear now, something truly unique and groundbreaking that deserved his time, commitment and nurture. He had a sensitive ear for what sounded good, and though he was self-taught, he knew his playing was proficient and tasteful enough to benefit a rock and roll band, which is exactly why the Velvet Underground were the right fit. The band's abrasive sound was polarizing, but Sterling's subtle playing helped round off some of those rough edges. Sterling was also an intelligent, critical thinker and had the confidence to challenge Lou and John's eccentric creative ideas without hesitation. He was the level-headed one who the others often consulted for his opinion and who always prioritized the interest of the band as a whole. He was also articulate, witty, and a captivating storyteller. In this film, we will take a detailed look into his background, his style of playing, his intuitive contributions to the music, and the turbulent story, from his perspective, of one of the most important bands of the 1960s.
Levittown. Well, you know, my father said he thought it was a fertilizer. Levittown was built on potato fields, and then they put the development up. And we had so many talented people. Billy Joel went to the same green that we did. Levittown has 4 village greens. I live near the West Green. Mo and Sterling live near the South Green. And their school was different. I didn't know them till we were all in high school. Sterling decided to change schools and came over to Division Avenue High School, where my brother and I and sister went. I was about 16. He was 2 years ahead of me. He was very cool. He wore wraparound shades, and he had a car across the street from the school, one of those black cars that look like a shark. I was really not cool like he was. I'm on the other side of the street headed home with my violin case, and I'd seen him, so you know. I was checking him out. So that's how we met, although I certainly heard about him. By the time I was hanging around with him, I was probably 19, and he was 21. He already was playing guitar. He had no strap, so I bought him a strap. And he wasn't bringing it to parties yet. We just knew Sterling was playing the guitar at home. I got to know Mo and her brother Jim because I was going to the community college. And my brother said, oh, Tucker's sister's going there too. Why don't you ride with her? So that's how we met and became friends. We graduated in 1962. Mo and I are the same age. The boys were already out. And when we were all graduated, our parents let us have a party at our house. My brother Tom's friends, Sterling was one, and my friends, which was pretty cool. He always had his guitar for Saturday night parties. He would learn something, and we're all sitting around drinking and laughing and applauding when he finally learned something like green onions, for instance. So it was a very slow thing right before my eyes.
Over the subsequent years of self-teaching and casual practicing, Sterling developed a style of playing that had an unpretentious, aspirational quality to it. His influences were mainly black rhythm and blues and rockabilly artists, and of course the rock and roll that evolved afterward.
I listened to Alan Freed and Jocko Henderson all the time, kept my honky ears open. Doo-wop music impressed me mightily. Later on, I liked Mickey Baker. His guitar playing on Love is Strange was out of this world.
Take it for a game.
Also T-Bone Walker and Jimmy Reed. Eventually, I caught up with acoustical blues aces like Lightning Hopkins, but always preferred electric guitar music and special effects. I got a flyer in the mail from Sam Ash Music in Hempstead inviting me to hear a demonstration of the newly invented fuzz tone. I didn't have to go because my amp was already doing that on its own. I graduated high school with very high numbers and matching low self-esteem for just about everything but music. I was accepted at Syracuse along with Maureen's brother Jim, Regent scholarships for both of us. Jim went, but I headed west to the University of Illinois majoring in physics. Left there at the request of the dean after 2 semesters, mostly for not attending class and for having been drummed out of the ROTC, which was compulsory. Good grades, bad attitude.
He then headed back to Syracuse in the fall of 1961 to sit in for the fall term. He never did enroll, but would go and stay at Sadler Hall in Jim Tucker's room on the couch for months at a time, which happened to be directly beneath where Lou Reed was staying.
When I was a student at Syracuse, I was just in my room one night late playing records with 2 friends. We had old blues records, and Ray Charles and Lightning Hopkins and things. And suddenly there came a knock on the door, and we thought it was the person in charge of the dormitory coming down to complain, because that's usually what happened. And instead it was the guy upstairs, who turned out to be Lou. And he needed records because he had a campus radio show, and he was running out of blues and that sort of thing. And my roommate was a guy named Bob Davidson, and he was a big collector. So and I had my things too. So Lou borrowed some records, and we had made plans to have him see all we had, but he was kicked off the radio show before we ever did much of that. We actually lent him just about a few albums. Lou was pretty guarded about himself, but he did let it be known that he was an English major and that he liked to write poetry. And he didn't say anything about playing music. And then one day, the ROTC, which is a military training program that they have in colleges, their people were out marching around. There's an athletic field behind the dorm, and suddenly we could hear this real loud humming and buzzing upstairs. And then it was somebody playing electric guitar at full volume. So then I knew that Lou was a guitar player too. And then we just went from there. It's always pretty hard to pry things out of Lou about his childhood because of his odd relationship with his parents and all that sort of thing. But it would come out in little pieces. But he was trained on piano, apparently, because he can play piano some, but he didn't pursue it at all seriously. And then he had some little teeny bands, the way we all did. But Lou went one step further than I did, and a step further than almost anybody does. He actually made a record.
Everybody can sit around and snap their fingers, but who actually cares enough to try to make a record himself? Lou went that extra step. Is it a good record? No, but it exists. So that astounded me. Not only had I found there was a guitar player upstairs, but also one who made a record.
This record, a single entitled So Blue, backed with Leave Her For Me by the Jades, was written by Lou, and he also plays the guitar on the recording, which was made in 1958. The three-piece band had previously played at a talent show at Freeport Junior High School to an enthusiastic audience response, and Time Records producer Bob Shad brought in the session musician King Curtis to play saxophone on both the songs. The single did not chart, but it was played by Paul Sherman on Murray the K's radio show, much to Lou's regret, since Murray Kaufman himself was sick the day he was told they would play it. Lou had been studying creative writing with Delmore Schwartz, a teacher in the English department who taught poetry such as James Joyce. According to Sterling, Delmore was a paranoid schizophrenic and drunkard, which made it very difficult for him to deal with students, or with anyone for that matter. He believed he was being investigated at the behest of Nelson Rockefeller, and eventually decided that Lou, Jim and Sterling, as well as several other students and people around him, were all Rockefeller's spies, and became increasingly frightened by and hateful towards them, which was deeply upsetting to Lou, who liked and admired him greatly. Sterling left Syracuse in 1963 to go back home and raise some more money, and eventually enrolled at City College in the fall of that year, majoring in English literature, and managed to find an apartment in the city. He continued to visit Syracuse frequently, bringing along his guitar and playing with Lou whenever possible, having found that they both had an abiding affection for Lightnin' Hopkins and doo-wop music.
College was a repressive place in the 60s. That's why people were trying to burn them down by 1965, like in that movie, If. I don't think Lou has fond memories of Syracuse. He got his degree. They told him that if he kept his mouth shut, he could get his diploma and get out of there. He defended a student whose father was a big corporation lawyer. They wanted Lou thrown out, but this guy and his father were so obnoxious that the dean actually sided with Lou. So he did graduate, which was incredible. I ran into him by accident when Lightnin' Hopkins was playing in the Village. I naturally made my pilgrimage with Jim, and there was Lou. The next time I saw him was in February of '65, and he was with Cale. The two of them were doing nothing. I was doing nothing. So they said, well, why don't we just jam? I said, okay, and we kept doing it.
Lou had met John shortly after getting a job as a staff songwriter for the budget label Pickwick Records in 1964. John was a classically trained music student who was already establishing himself in experimental music circles. Originally from Wales, he studied music and composition at the University of London's Goldsmiths College, and later won a Leonard Bernstein Fellowship to study at Tanglewood Music Centre in Massachusetts in 1963, aided by the composer Aaron Copland. He had a disagreement with Tanglewood's music director Eric Leinsdorf, however, and moved to New York and began working with avant-garde composer John Cage and later Lamont Young, who he performed with in the Theatre of Eternal Music. Experimental filmmaker Tony Conrad was also a performer in the group, who befriended John and subsequently invited him to share his apartment at 56 Ludlow Street and split the rent between them. At a party they attended together, they were both approached by Jerry Vance of Pickwick Records, who invited them to participate in recording a new pop song and performing it in the band he was assembling named The Primitives. They casually accepted and went out to Queens to be introduced to the other members, Walter Di Maria and Lou, who had recently written the song in collaboration with Jerry as well as Jimmy Sims and Terry Phillips, which was about a fake novelty dance entitled The Ostrich. John was intrigued by Lou's use of an alternate guitar tuning for the song's recording. This intrigue sparked conversations between the two, and it became quickly apparent to John that Lou's aspirations, both musically and poetically, were in a completely different league to what the two of them were doing for a paycheck at that moment in time.
Trying to find a role in classical music that really had anything to do with the outside world was certainly not clear in my mind. And I was using improvisation as a way of finding a footing in my own personality. Words were not something that I was really adept with, although I loved all sorts of English language experimentation. And Lou was very adept at spontaneously erupting into elegant forms of prose and poetry.
They began working on Lou's private material, including one song called Heroine that he wrote while at Syracuse, as well as I'm Waiting for the Man and Venus in Furs. They also started busking on the street outside jazz clubs in Harlem such as the Baby Grand to support themselves. It was the following year when the duo chanced upon Sterling on the subway. Lou and John have both been quoted saying that Sterling had no shoes on at the time of the pivotal meeting. However,
This account, though amusing, is preposterous. I did indeed run into Lou and John for the first time on the subway, on the D train at the 7th Avenue stop or thereabouts. I was on my way up to school at City College. I had never, ever gone shoeless on the dog-shit streets of Manhattan. They invited me over to this guy Rick's place to get high and talk and play music. But then the whole thing with Pickwick had fallen through, so we sat around and said, well, we're retired. There's no way we can put a band together that can work in this city.
In 1965, the pop music scene, wherever it was going to go without us. John had no pop involvement whatsoever, and Lou and I had given up. It was impossible. The bands all had matching suits. It's unlikely that we can work out any of these dance routines, so I guess we've had it. That was our conclusion. So Lou, John, and I, having concluded that we'd had it, were then free to pursue anything we wanted. John's background is a lot better documented, but John also didn't want to talk about it, and still doesn't, because when we first met him, he was rebelling against his formal training. It used to drive us crazy. In order to copyright a song, you have to come out with a lead sheet, which is just a transcription by notes, and you put down the lyrics. For Lou and I, or for Lou and me, it was very difficult to do these things. You know, we have to sit around, well, what notes are they and how to write music. We can read and write music, but it's hard. You have to think. John could do it instantly, but refused. We could never get him to do the lead sheets. I said, John, it would only take you a minute. No, I didn't want to hear about it. So if we used to ask John, well, what about your training? He didn't want to talk about it. But I know that he started piano at 3 and viola at 5 and played on the BBC when he was 8 because he was considered a prodigy. John doesn't talk about that either. It doesn't make that much difference to him. But he always could really play.
At this time, Lou was living with his parents in Freeport, Long Island, Sterling was still living in his apartment in the city, and John was still living at Ludlow Street with Tony. Lou would drive in on weekends from Freeport and stay with John, and Sterling would take the subway over.
I was hip, not like people living in Freeport, Long Island with their parents. That was ridiculous.
On an early spring day in 1965, John and Sterling were strolling through the East Side slums and ran into Angus MacLise, a bohemian poet and world traveller who also happened to be a classically trained percussionist, on the corner of Essex and Delancey. Angus had previously been John's upstairs neighbour at Ludlow Street, and they also performed together in the Theatre of Eternal Music. In conversation, Angus suggested that they should all visit Piero Heliczer, another ex-neighbour from Ludlow Street who lived in the next-door apartment to John and Tony, and was a bona fide underground filmmaker. Piero and Angus were organising a mixed-media stage presentation titled Rights of the Dream Weapon to appear at a new cinema festival event held by the Filmmakers Cooperative, an organisation co-founded by Jonas Mekas, a Lithuanian-American independent filmmaker and poet, as well as several other notable underground filmmakers of the period, who frequently organised exhibition events at various locations around the city under the brand The Filmmakers Cinematheque. The current venue location at that time was the Astor Place Playhouse in the basement of the Colonnade building on Lafayette Street. In the centre of the stage there was a movie screen, dancers swirled around, and poetry and song occasionally rose up, while from behind the screen a strange music was being generated by Lou, John, Angus and Sterling. Angus had an unusual percussion style consisting mainly of playing hand drums, having picked up various instruments as souvenirs from his travels, such as bongos, tabla, cymbalum and tambourine. He had spent years in India and Greece and was heavily influenced by Eastern music, so he applied this style to the improvisational music that the others were playing.
From the very beginning, we never did have standard percussion. We had one theory that said all bands tend to sound alike because all the drumming is alike. We said our drumming is not going to be like everyone else's. For me, the path ahead became suddenly clear. I could work on music that was different from ordinary rock and roll since Piero had given us a context to perform it in. We really wanted to do something, so at the end of the summer we had these photos taken by Donald Greenhouse, Lou's next-door neighbor in Freeport. The one you see where we're standing in the doorway and up on the roof, the first pictures of the band. We didn't say, we have a great idea and we're going to pursue it to great glory. We were playing Smokey Robinson and related things, some of our little ideas too, but we were just playing for fun. The nice thing about bands is that it's nice to play music with other people. I never wanted to be a solo artist. A good riff, I always thought, was worth more than a good guitar solo.
Well, I've told you once and I've told you twice, but you never listen to my advice. You don't try very hard to please me. With what you know, it should be easy. Well, this could be the last time. This could be the last time. Maybe the last time. I don't know. Oh no. Oh no.
Like The Last Time by the Stones, a great riff, beautiful. Having done that, they don't need to play slick solos or anything else. So we tried to put some thinking into that, what the song actually needs. A few well-chosen notes.
It was during this development period that the group made a demo tape recording of all of their material up to that point, which was first released in 1995 as part of the Peel Slowly and See CD box set. The tape is missing percussion from Angus, however, who according to John Cale was very much living on the Angus calendar and didn't appreciate the need to turn up to rehearsals on time.
The tape was primarily for ourselves, and then we thought we might as well play it for other people too, in case someone might get interested. John was going back and forth to England throughout 1965 to see what he could get going and to pick up records. Obscure English bands were closer to our sensibilities than the pop groups here in the US. At the time, when we met Andy, we had all but actually packed up and gone to London. I feel certain that we would have been in London by spring of '66, come what may, had not the EPI happened.
John Cale recalled, "At first we called ourselves the Warlocks and then the Falling Spikes, but these names weren't very poetic or intriguing. Then one day we saw an S&M novel Tony had found on the street called The Velvet Underground. It was perfect, though there was nothing velvet about the underground world we were living in, that's for sure."
We had a name at last. It was adopted by us and deemed appropriate, not because of the S&M theme of the book, but because the word underground was suggestive of our involvement with the underground film and art scenes. The band never set out to be devoted to sexual weirdness. That was wholly accidental. We did at the time have a song, Venus in Furs, so that reinforced the associations.
I am weary. I could sleep 1,000 years, 1,000 dreams that would awake me, different colors made of tears.
In the winter of 1965, Lou, John, Sterling and Angus all moved to a fifth-floor apartment at 450 Grand Street, which was directly above Piero Heliczer's apartment on the fourth floor, so they were now able to play together all the time and regularly collaborated with Heliczer in his multimedia happenings at the Cinematheque. Barbara Rubin, an enthusiastic young underground filmmaker and familiar face to John Cale, whose Ludlow Street apartment was the shooting location of her 1963 short film Christmas on Earth, had been loosely following the development of the band, especially since they had started collaborating with Piero. After attending a house party with Allen Ginsberg, who she knew from working for the Filmmakers Cooperative, she befriended Al Aronowitz, a music journalist who had recently started managing a band called The Middle Class. She told him about the Velvet's performances behind the screens at the Cinematheque, and also of Lou Reed's boastful claim that he was the fastest guitarist alive. Al Aronowitz later recalled, "The Lower East Side wasn't referred to as the East Village in those days, which is where I found the Velvet Underground. At this time I am managing The Middle Class in a gentleman's agreement with Jerry Goffin and Carole King, the producers. Barbara attaches herself to me, and before long she's urging me to take on the job of managing the Velvets. She tells me, 'I see something in this group. They're the underground's rising stars. They need a manager like you.' To make a long story short, she even gets me believing her. I make a date with the band in their fifth-floor walk-up. The time for this date falls on a moment when I have just introduced Carole King to Brian Jones, and we are enjoying a conversation while riding through Manhattan in Brian's rented limousine. I finally have to break in and tell Carole and Brian that I've got this date in the bowels of the Lower East Side. 'No problem,' they say, and we drive to the address. Brian and Carole wait in the limo while I climb the 5 flights, catch my breath, and we talk things over. I tell them I'll start them off with gigs in village clubs that will tighten and polish them for a rock audience. Lou Reed objects that they want to be overnight stars like the Beatles. I can't promise that, I tell them. I can get you exposure, you yourselves have to do the rest. Al had made a handshake deal with Lou to become their manager, and his first offer was an opening act performance under his headlining group, The Middle Class, at Summit High School in New Jersey for $75. Angus objected, claiming he didn't want anything to do with being commercialized, saying, "You mean we start when they tell us to, and we have to end when they tell us to? I can't work that way." The rest of the band were eager to accept the job and start expanding their audience. In defiance, Angus abruptly withdrew. CBS News decided that Walter Cronkite should have a feature on an underground film being made. By whatever selection process, Piero was able to be the underground filmmaker. He decided to film the band playing in November 1965 for his film Venus in Furs, an experimental film shot on 8mm about a nun and a nurse who go to hell for their sinful life in St. Vincent's Hospital, and the shoot was simultaneously filmed by the TV camera crew. Appearing shirtless and with their faces painted, Lou, playing his Kent Copart electric guitar, John, playing his viola, and Sterling, playing his Danelectro guitar, performed Heroin together with their new recruit Maureen Tucker, playing a tambourine, who wore a bridal gown with a black veil and face mask underneath. Angus MacLise also appears playing percussion instruments on the floor, despite his recent departure from the band, as well as Piero himself joining in on a saxophone and Barbara Rubin playing the nun. The full news item was to be broadcast on December 31st, 1965, and would be the band's first TV appearance.
Angus thought we were in it for the art. We said, "Angus, we're dying, we have no money, and we're talking about $75, which was going to be split 4 ways. It was no sellout.
Maureen was the sister of an old friend of mine, and also was friends with Lou. And so when Angus left, she just came in to do, just to do a little percussion and just fool around. I don't know, it was very casual. And since she was willing to do different things, then she stayed.
Well, I had known Sterling since I was 10, because he had been friends with my brother. And they needed a drummer for this one show in New Jersey. And they had no time to be looking around or auditioning or anything. And Sterling apparently said, "Oh, Tucker's sister plays drums." So Lou came to my house to see if I could actually play. And it was supposed to be for that one show. Once we were walking, I don't remember where we were going, we were walking down the street, the 4 of us, and I don't know who said what, but I remember Cale saying, "No chicks in the band." Aha. Fooled him. It just sort of became official because it worked. We were basically the rhythm section. Not the bass and me, but the guitar player and me. Sterling was a great rhythm guitar player, I think. He had solos in a number of songs, and I loved his guitar playing, solos or rhythm. Sterling was a more technical guitar player than Lou. That's not a put down, but he was much more technical, and for him to go flying off into space, I can't even imagine him even thinking of doing that.
At Summit, the murmur of surprise that greeted our appearance as the curtain went up increased to a roar of disbelief once we started to play Venus, and swelled to a mighty howl of outrage and bewilderment by the end of Heroin. Aronowitz observed that we seemed to have an oddly stimulating and polarizing effect on audiences.
Al's recollection of this event and what transpired afterward was, "So I gave them their first gig in the high school auditorium in the white, wealthy and waspy New Jersey suburb of Summit. I'm taping the concert on my brand new woolen sack tape recorder, with which the Velvets simply walk away. Someone tells me he saw them pack it up with their equipment. It doesn't take me very long to discover that the Velvets are a bunch of speed freaks and junkies. Then I got them a residency gig at the Café Bazaar, a well-known village tourist trap on West 3rd Street, to acquire some chops, like the Beatles did playing till 3 a.m. 8 nights a week in Hamburg, and they kept complaining that they wanted to be overnight stars. I start bringing people in to see them, and one of those I bring into the Café Bazaar is this gorgeous blonde who goes by the name of Nico. She immediately gets the hots for Lou and starts dreaming of the Velvets as her backup band. She goes after Andy Warhol and gets him to come see the Velvets. Warhol keeps coming in and keeps coming in. In a meeting I have with Lou Reed around this time, he never mentions Andy. In my mind, Andy was not very ethical in the way he stole away my management of the Velvets. Most accounts claim it was Barbara Rubin who visited the factory, pop artist Andy Warhol's studio loft on East 47th Street, after seeing the band performing at the Café Bazaar, and invited Gerard Malanga, Andy's chief assistant, to come and dance while the band performed, insisting that he also bring his whip. Allen Ginsberg stated that she dedicated her life to introducing geniuses to each other in the hope that they would collaborate to make great art that would change the world.
It was a very small club, and we were all sitting in the back row, just really wanted them, me and my friends, to succeed. And so many times people just walked out on them. We just wanted it to happen. We wanted people to like them. And they just kept doing what they did. also hoping that they would be successful, but it's really not what kept them going. They just were going to do their music. It was a slow initiation.
Gerard Malanga recalled, "During the intermission, Barbara introduced me to Lou Reed and John Cale, and they both said I should come back and dance again. They really wanted people to dance to the music, not just sit and listen to it." The next day, Gerard informed Paul Morrissey, another associate of Andy's who had recently joined the factory crew working the sound and lights in his films, about the band, and since Barbara wanted to film some footage of them, asked if he would come along and assist with the lighting. Paul Morrissey recalled, "The first thing that registered to me, and I think to Andy later, was the drummer, Maureen, because you could not tell if she was a boy or girl. The second thing was John Cale's viola, and the third thing was that they sang a song called Heroin. The next day I said, 'Andy, I've found the group to play at Uptight.' So Andy came down the very next night. Gerard invited Nico, who had just come to town, and that's when I met her. He'd already brought her record, I'm Not Sayin', up to the factory. I didn't think that Lou had the personality to stand in front of the group and sing. The group needed something beautiful to counteract the kind of screeching ugliness that they were trying to sell. That very night, right away I said, 'Nico, maybe you can sing with this group if they want to work with us.'" Andy Warhol's Uptight was the intended title of a multimedia show that Paul had proposed in response to Michael Meyerberg, a famous Broadway producer, who had recently approached Andy with the idea of opening a new discotheque and wanted to pay for his regular attendance, hoping that his presence alone would help bring publicity. Paul suggested instead that it would be better if Andy was able to present a group he managed, something he had been pondering for a while since temporarily stopping painting and looking for new sources of income to support the movies he'd been making that weren't generating any profit, and project his underground films upon the group while they performed. Meyerberg was keen on the idea, so when Andy later saw the Velvets performing their hypnotic, supersonic music at the Café Bizarre, with Gerard mesmerically dancing in front of them, with his whip and black leather pants resembling a cross between the frog and Egyptian belly dance, he instantly connected the music and lyrics with the underground film scene he had been championing, and envisioned their integration within the proposed multimedia show concept. He realised then that it would be quite unlike anything ever seen or heard before. After the set, Barbara introduced the band to Andy, and they immediately hit it off. This proved to be the trajectory-changing moment that lifted the band from a path of uncertainty. It was late December 1965, and the band were getting fed up with the management of the venue, who not only made them work on Christmas Day, but also kept asking them to play cover songs rather than their original material, which they found to be too disruptive for their establishment. They decided to deliberately get themselves fired by cranking out a furiously passionate performance of the Black Angels' death song, having been previously warned never to play it again. This took place 2 days after they first met Andy, who was impressed by their refusal to accept any form of preconditioned order or restraint. So in turn, he invited them to come and visit the factory.
Well, we knew Andy by reputation. Didn't know anything about him in particular, except that he was this artist and what he was, I would summarize his public image at the time. He was a pop artist, and he had already started to make films. In one of the underground film showings, he contributed, a piece or two, which you basically couldn't look at, eat, kiss, or one of those things. So I didn't know anything about him, and we weren't art groupies, so it didn't. But then he started talking about doing the show, and that did get our interest. It was kind of what we'd been doing with underground films, except this time we would come out from back behind the screen. We did and we didn't, because in the context of the show with projections, you could hardly ever see us anyway. In the show, we weren't trying to get the spotlight, incidentally. It wasn't the Velvet Underground up front, and all this stuff behind us just as backdrop. As a matter of fact, we weren't in front. We were on stage, and then in front of us were the dancers, whoever they might be, Gerard, Mary, Ronnie Catrone, and all their props. So if there's anything to look at, you might look at them, because they were much more mobile and active than we were. So you might want to look at the foreground dancing, or you might want to look at the background, films, lights, and all the rest of it. Velvet Underground, well, they're someplace spread out in and among the equipment. You know, we had big piles of amplifiers. You could hide behind them if you felt like. So we weren't we didn't consider ourselves the center of attraction. If the show had a star, and it wasn't Andy, then it would be Gerard or someone doing something spectacular, be the dancers. But we played the music.
Paul Morrissey recalled, "After we met them, they came to the factory, and right away I proposed that we would sign a contract with them. We'd manage them and give them a place to play. They said yes, and Andy immediately bought them some new amplifiers, and they started rehearsing at the factory."
It was a fascinating place. Everyone who was talented or famous or rich or any of the above sooner or later would come through the factory and you would meet them. Art people, money people, movie makers, movie stars. You would sit there on the couch and say hello to whoever came by. We were there day and night for months. That's where we were practicing. The only thing we had to figure out was what parties to go to and in what order. The phone would ring and we would make a note. Where would we go to eat at night? That always took some thinking. We were a lot of people, then sort out the options as far as all those parties are concerned. It's not an exaggeration. Andy Warhol's been invited to more parties than any 100 people put together. You can't imagine. The phone would ring and ring and ring. We'd just come up from Ludlow Street where no one visited us, with good reason. Andy was generally considered to be a charlatan, and naturally anybody associated with him was the same. So he was the phony artist, and we were the phony band, drug addicts and homosexuals. There was very little in the way of negatives that wasn't said about us. We were the lowest of the low, and we said, well, okay, but we're well educated. We eat with the right fork at the table.
You know, he understood exactly what we were about and what our creative side was all about and how best to bring that out. And gave us a lot of support. I mean, I doubt that Lou would have continued investigating song subjects like he did without having some kind of outside support for that approach other than myself. I mean, I think it was just basically Andy and I who really encouraged that side of a literary endeavor.
During their initial rehearsal period at the beginning of January 1966, Andy and Paul also encouraged the band to collaborate with Nico. This was met with reluctance initially, as the Velvets had no interest in being anyone's backing band. However, since Andy was in a position to offer them a chance to potentially become famous in his upcoming show, and Lou and Nico happened to hit it off together, they agreed to collaborate, and Lou began writing some songs specifically for her to sing, such as Femme Fatale and I'll Be Your Mirror, in addition to rearranging one of his pre-existing songs, All Tomorrow's Parties, to suit her voice.
If I knew more about Nico, I could say a lot about her. She was always very mysterious to us in the band. We were not widely traveled. We were not sophisticated. We were just suburban brats, except for John. John had traveled, but didn't have any money in particular. Nico was this glamorous European model and movie star and all this kind of thing. So we didn't know quite what to make of her, except that she could sing, and I always will insist on that. She was not there just simply to stand up and be beautiful. We didn't need that. We had beautiful people dancing.
Andy had been invited to give a lecture at the annual meeting of the New York Society for Clinical Psychiatry on January 10th, 1966, at the Delmonico Hotel. However, given his recent acquisition, he instead decided to give the Velvets their first outing. They performed for the first time with Nico, with Gerard Malanga dancing in front of them, together with actress and fashion model Edie Sedgwick. Barbara Rubin and Jonas Markus went around spontaneously interviewing the psychiatrists and their wives, asking them rude questions, such as, "Do you eat her out?" or "Is his penis big enough?" Jonas Markus recalled, "The main purpose was to try to embarrass them. I think we succeeded in doing that, but we were not pushy, we did it quite politely, and because of the politeness in which our questions were presented, they sounded even more outrageous than they actually were."
That's a great article, by the way, by Grace Glick in the New York Times. The psychiatrists had turned out in droves for the dinner where they're to be entertained, a way to study Andy Warhol. Quote, "Creativity and the artist have always held a fascination with a serious student of human behavior." So what were the psychiatrists' reactions?
But they thought it was a little bit too intense, I think. About half the audience left with the psychiatrist.
You mean the psychiatrist actually walked out on you?
Yeah.
You think you thought that...
Oh, a lot of them
Say,
did.
What's he gonna say?
Some of them did. Actually, I think they were expecting Andy to give an after-dinner speech.
He didn't.
Well, he didn't, and
He gave
that
an
upset them.
after-dinner program.
And our real purpose there was to film the reactions of the psychiatrists as we played. And we did, and it's really very fascinating. Well, there's another article that uses that for caption, "Shock Treatment for Psychiatrists."
Oh, they did use that.
Yeah, I don't know.
In February, preparations for the Uptight show with Michael Meyerberg began, with the Velvets performing at the new location of the filmmaker's Cinematheque on West 41st Street for an entire week, since Jonas Markus had previously offered the slot to Andy to screen a retrospective of his films with Edie. Instead, the Velvets were given the stage, while Andy, Paul and Danny Williams, Andy's lover at that time, who was an electronics expert and filmmaker who oversaw the design of the light shows, experimented with the lighting and projection setups. Gerard Malanga recalled, "Everyone who was involved with that week at the Cinematheque was very excited about what we were doing together, although there were a number of kinks to be ironed out before it would bloom into the exploding plastic inevitable. We all went out to dinner after each show, and Andy's question to everybody was always the same: how can we make it more interesting?" Michael Meyerberg attended one of the shows at the Cinematheque and began to call off the idea of working on it, but word was spreading among film departments in colleges, and Andy was invited to present the show at Rutgers University in New Jersey. The Uptight team initially consisted of the Velvets, Andy, Paul, Gerard, Nico, Danny, photographer Billy Linick, Edie Sedgwick, actor Donald Lyons, and equipment manager Dave Faison, who casually got involved with the Velvets through a mutual friend and stayed with them throughout the Warhol period. Dave single-handedly cared for and carried around all their equipment during the early days in his pink station wagon and set it up at all the shows. He was very important to the show, and being quite the handyman, later designed and built the metal stand for Maureen's bass drum so that she could quit using chairs to hold it up horizontally, which looked messy and wasn't very stable, and also modified her bass drum pedal so that it could be used from the underside. Edie Sedgwick's involvement with the show was brief, since soon after the Velvet Underground joined the factory, despite having been Andy's muse in several of his underground films up to that point, her professional relationship with him had almost completely deteriorated due to her increasingly erratic behaviour related to mental health issues exacerbated by drug addiction. One night, while the entire entourage, including the Velvets, were out for dinner, Edie had a bitter argument with Andy, stormed off, and never worked with Warhol or came to the factory again. She later went into rehab and abstained from drugs for some time, during which she got married to a fellow patient, but unfortunately relapsed and died of an overdose in November 1971. She had been the inspiration for Lou Reed's song Femme Fatale after Andy had requested him to write a song about her. Gerard was joined by a new dance partner, Mary Woronov, with whom he developed a choreographed whip dance especially for the song Venus in Furs, plus extra dancers Ronnie Cutrone and Ingrid Superstar. Ingrid, who later disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1986, said the following to Nat Finkelstein during a taped interview at the factory in 1966. "You want me to describe Sterling Morrison? Sterling is very tall and lanky and slender and lean, and he's got shaggy medium brown hair that looks like it's never been combed or washed. And he's got blue eyes, usually concealed by sunglasses, and he usually wears striped shirts and brown or white Levi's, and he's got a couple of faded blemishes on his face. Sterling's the friendliest. He's a pussycat. He can tell the funniest jokes. He'll have you in stitches, rolling, And yet he seems to be so quiet, sort of a Bill Wyman type. But Sterling is the biggest extrovert, the most open. He's a regular guy. He'll sit here with a beer and tell jokes and tell stories. Another performance was booked a few days after New Jersey at the University of Michigan Film Festival in Ann Arbor, to which the troupe travelled in what Sterling recalled as some kind of recreational vehicle, which was driven by Nico. Andy Warhol recalled, "I still don't know if she had a licence. She'd only been in this country a little while and she'd keep forgetting and drive on the British side of the road. She was shooting across sidewalks and over people's lawns." Ann Arbor went crazy. At last, the Velvets were a smash. We had strobe lights with us for the first time. They went perfectly with the chaos music the Velvets played. The local papers interviewed me during the intermission. "If they can take it for 10 minutes, then play it for 15, I'd explain. That's our policy. Always leave them wanting less."
The RV had a 120-volt AC generator on the back that supplied power to the inside. We could play our amps as we rolled along. The AC power, it came in handy because we blew the alternator on the engine outside of Toledo on the way back to New York. The police so despised us that they insisted we get out of the city limits at once. It was night, and we had no lights, but Danny cranked up the generator on the back and ran extension cords from inside to some photo flood lamps he clamped to the bumper. The police followed us all the way to the line. I began to think it was dangerous to cross the Hudson.
After they came back, they performed at Paraphernalia, the ultra-hip clothes store featuring the designs of Betsy Johnson, who John Cale later married in 1968. The chic boutique was mobbed as the group soared through heroin, while Nico and Gerard danced together and Andy's films bounced off the walls. Brian Jones was one of the many onlookers, along with countless models, other artists, and press. Meanwhile, Paul was trying to find a new permanent venue for the show, and in conversation with Andy at the Figaro restaurant, was overheard by Jackie Cassam and Rudy Stern, who said, "You're looking for a dance hall to present a rock and roll group? We present concerts with light shows and know a wonderful place." The venue in question was the Polish National Home, commonly known as the Dom, on St. Mark's Place. Paul arranged a lease through the attorneys Cy Litvinoff, and Andy paid for the entire month of April, so the Velvets and Faison moved all the equipment in, and Gerard immediately started painting the wall behind the stage white. Paul quickly put an ad in the Village Voice in preparation, where the name of the event was changed from Uptight to the Erupting Plastic Inevitable, after he randomly skimmed through some liner notes from a Bob Dylan record, with those being the only words that grabbed his attention. It was later revised to the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. He recalled, "We moved in on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and at 8 o'clock that night all these people showed up. It was packed, an enormous success from its very first night."
The Dom was an unused, huge hall with a nice high stage, nice high ceilings, and a balcony. A wonderful location. It was perfect. We had all our stuff in there, and we had continuity. When we opened the place, there was nothing going on there. There was no East Village. More than anyone, we invented that street. We showed up and opened up the Dom and did extremely well. Once the papers started saying that something strange was happening at St. Mark's Place, then all the mink coat people came down to see what it was. We went to their parties, and they had fabulous apartments and fabulous amounts of money. If you were very rich, the main problem is boredom. So if anything different happens, these people would flock to it, unless it's something so dangerously different that they can't be seen at it.
John Cale recalled, "There were 4 projectors, all projecting different kinds of film. There were slides, there was a mirror ball overhead, on which was shone several different coloured pin lights, so it was swimming in stars, and the one wall was covered with multiple images, and then Nico would stand in white in the middle of this darkened stage. April 1966 was our best month with Andy. If I could freeze a moment that symbolised the positive character of our work together, it would be on stage at the Dom." Andy Warhol recalled, "The Velvets played so loud and crazy I couldn't even begin to guess the decibels. I knew something revolutionary was happening, we just felt it. Things couldn't look this strange and new without some barrier being broken."
I think the shows with Andy were really a lot of fun and really interesting and so different at the time and new. And in fact, very often on stage, I would think, man, I'd like to be out there and seeing this. It must be really interesting. In fact, Martha, Sterling's wife, and I were friends, and very often would just kind of look at each other like, you know, what the hell are we doing here? I won't say it was culture shock, but certainly very different from my life in Levittown.
They were at the Dom for months. Mo used to park her car right in front of the Dom on 8th Street and got a ticket every time and never did anything about him. And then she put all her tickets in a big box and put it in my parents' attic, as if that's going to make everything disappear. So that's my first memory of the Dom. And we went every weekend, traveling in with Mo, sometimes Lou. It was like a 30-minute drive for us from Levittown to the city. It was stunning, really. Dancing, the mirror ball, the crowd, it just grew into that. And it just got more exciting. Sterling would play, come back and sit down at the table, and he'd say to me, "Was that awful?" He just didn't have the confidence that he should have had. There was a big room upstairs, but down was a small bar, and folk singers were there, like Jackson Brown, and we were making fun of them. We had no interest in folk music. Nico would sing down there, too, on her own, and one of the guys would accompany her on nights that they weren't playing upstairs. So that was a great time. We used to have some good food there. There were families living in those old buildings, and you could go down the steps into their house and get a great beef dinner for a certain amount of money. We just discovered those kinds of things. That was a lot of fun.
Folk singers cared about the starving in Africa. I care about the starving in Africa. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with rock and roll music. Anyone who needs Bob Dylan to tell him which way the wind is blowing is a serious mental defective. If you could actually express what people think but don't say, that would be an amazing accomplishment. You don't have to get into these incredible conceptual bags and try to teach people anything. I don't want to teach people anything, ever, in music. I think the Velvet Underground encourages people to do what they feel like doing. Use whatever instruments they feel like using. Play whatever songs they feel like playing. And also, the music is not preachy, and that makes it bearable over the years.
All the songs that were around at the time were asking questions, and no one seemed to be really giving answers, but that all of those problems, in literary problems that they are, were taken care of by just making first-person songs. Those are the most powerful ones because it involves the viewer closely in what's going on.
During the first weekend of shows at the Dom, Cy Litvinov introduced Paul Morrissey to a young concert booker named Charlie Rothschild, who had worked at the Gerde's Folk City venue on West 4th Street, and also for Bob Dylan's manager Albert Grossman.
I don't know who brought him around. Certainly it wasn't me.
He said to Paul, "You really have a great thing going here. You need somebody professional to manage it for you. I could run the box office here with a friend." Paul accepted the offer of assistance with the best of intentions, but unfortunately, it would later prove to be against the interest of the EPI venture. With the show proving to be successful as quickly as it did and making good money, $18,000 in the first week, Paul proposed to Andy about the Velvets. Now we have to make a record with them. Norman Dolph, a sales executive for Columbia Records who also started his own mobile disco service in and around New York as a side job, and who had previously supplied music for Andy at his art exhibitions and parties, was hired to run a soul and R&B disco in between the Velvets' long sets at the Dom. He recalled, "At the nights at the Dom, the first or second, Warhol said, well, we'd like to do an album of them, a record. I'm working for Columbia full time, and I said, I can help you with that. He said, oh, really? Okay, good, do it." I think he did that with a lot of people. He just made suggestions and people took him up on it. He didn't ask me any questions about this studio or that engineer or this producer or any of that. It was just, we'd like to make a record, and I said, I'll take care of it. One of the accounts Norman managed at Columbia, Scepter Records, had its own recording studio on West 54th Street, so he made an arrangement to split the costs for the sessions with Andy in exchange for one of his prints, and run the sessions for the Velvet Underground and Nico along with the studio's chief engineer, John Licata, who was allowed to use the studio with outside clients whenever it was free and pocket the money as a perk to his job.
One day it was announced that we had enough money to go into the studio, and we were going. And I said, oh, okay. We'll just move our equipment in and start blasting. And then when we had an album's worth of stuff, that means stop.
The advantage of having Andy Warhol as producer was that because he was Andy Warhol, they left everything in its pure state. And they would say, is that okay, Mr. Warhol? And he'd say, oh, yeah. And so they didn't change anything. And so right at the very beginning, we experienced what it was like to be in the studio and record things our way and have essentially total freedom. The record company never listened to the records in the first place, so they came out exactly like they'd been made. And we got to experience that freedom, but the only real reason I think we had that freedom is because Andy, as the quote producer, was saying, oh, that's great. And they'd say, oh, well, should we do this and that too? He said, oh no, you should, it's really great. He was a protector.
I remember being in the studio the first time, yeah, and it was very exciting to be making a record. And it was fun, but it was also nerve-wracking. We only had 8 hours. So none of us wanted to mess it up or have to do it again or whatever, because we just didn't have the time for it. Thank God. I think if we had 2 weeks, it would not have been as exciting. The record itself, the final product.
9 songs from these sessions, which took place in short slots over the course of 4 days in late April of 1966, were pressed onto an acetate that Dolph took to his employers in hopes of gaining a record deal for the Velvets. Columbia turned them down, as did several other labels due to the subject matter of titles like Heroin, but 6 of the recordings, Femme Fatale, Run Run Run, All Tomorrow's Parties, I'll Be Your Mirror, The Black Angel's Death Song, and European Sun, on the acetate would later be used after some remixing and re-recording of backing vocals on the final album.
It was about what it's like to take heroin. It wasn't pro or con. It was just about taking heroin from the point of view of someone taking it. There was other material to balance it out, a stop over here, a stop over there, a song about this, a song about that. But for some reason, putting it on record was considered at the time very, very shocking. And I always used to say to them, if this was a book, you would not consider this shocking. What is shocking about it? And I'm still not sure what was such a big deal.
Norman recalled of the sessions, you had an impression that Sterling was an important pair of ears in all of this. I don't know that anybody really told Lou Reed what to do, but you had the feeling that the musical decisions were being made largely by John Cale, sort of in conference with Sterling.
I don't want anybody to think that I was perfect and Lou was so hard to deal with. I was a pain in the ass. Perfectionism means incredible pain. I was always willing to be critical, and I was always critical of myself. I know that got to Lou, but that wasn't why I was doing it. I was compulsive, I guess, a bad trait. Lou complained about it at one point in the later days of the band, that he seldom got any praise out of me. I told him his voice sounded like it needed an operation or something. It wasn't always that way, but that's bad. Lou and I play real well together, and with John too. If we played in a normal E tuning, for John to get the pitch that he wanted in an open modal style, he would have to up-tune, which would put too much strain on the neck and bridge of the viola. To prevent that from happening, we down-tuned a half tone, sometimes a whole tone. We could, and did, play well together. Metronomically, we were a pretty accurate band. If we were speeding up and slowing down, it was by design. One of the things that people who observed the band live always remarked on was the communication on stage.
We always watched each other. we were always, I always watched because I would be here and Lou was next to me, and as soon as he started playing, I couldn't hear anybody else. So I didn't know where the hell we were in the song. I couldn't hear his voice in those days. There was no monitors, and I could never hear his voice, so I would be like this to see his mouth, to see where he was in a song. Not every song, of course, but louder songs. And we always were all watching each other, and I think that made a big difference in our live performance.
If I thought I played badly, it didn't matter if the audience tore the house down. I wasn't happy because I thought I had played like shit. I figured if those people were smarter, if they knew how the stuff ought to sound, they would realize. So I suffered as much for my own criticism as Lou and John did. John would just dismiss it, but Lou would listen and get irritated.
By the third week of shows at the Dom, Charlie Rothschild announced he had contacted the owners of the Trip on Sunset Strip in Los Angeles and secured the Velvets a 2-week booking. The dates of the contract were from May 3rd to 18th, with the possibility of extension dependent on their initial success. At that point in time, Andy had only paid until the end of April for the Dom. He and Paul had wanted to sign a lease for May also, but were told the venue was unavailable due to a prior booking for a Polish cultural celebration. On that basis, they accepted the booking at the Trip and decided they would pick things back up at the Dom when they returned. The Velvets played their last show at the Dom on April 30th, and then the entire troupe packed up all their equipment and flew out to LA on May 1st.
None of us had ever been out there. And we knew it was a separate world, but we weren't quite sure just how separate it might be. And we liked it a lot, but it was very intimidating also, because musically the West Coast was an organized force trying to predominate in the pop scene at the time. I remember we were in our rent-a-car coming back from the airport, and I turned on the radio. The first song that came out was Monday, Monday. And I said, well, I don't know. Maybe we're not ready for this sort of thing yet.
Just prior to flying out, Andy helped arrange the Velvets an endorsement deal with Vox USA, as immediately after they arrived before their opening night at the Trip, they visited the Thomas Organ factory in Sepulveda, Los Angeles, and collected a second AC-100 stack to replace the Sears Silvertone 1484 that Sterling had been using up until that point. They also received Vox's new Phantom 6 and Mark 12 guitar models in white, the latter of which was commonly known as the Teardrop, as well as 2 Phantom 4 basses in both red and white, plus the Vox Continental organ.
And I remember that Vox deal, because we were in California and we all went out to the factory. And there are pictures of them leaning on those amps. They were very excited about that.
Later on, Lou and Sterling's AC-100s would be replaced with the new solid-state Super Beetle models. John's Foundation stack would be replaced by a Westminster stack, and a Sovereign stack was also supplied to be used with the organ, which was changed first from a single manual Continental to a double manual Super Continental, and later to a Rheem Mark 7, which had more bass register and built-in fuzz effects. Despite popular belief, it was actually this more obscure model organ that John would later use on the recording of the song Sister Ray, rather than his previous Vox models. Even though they were photographed with their new equipment for the first time during their setup and sound checks at the Trip, it seems that despite such a generous equipment allocation, there is no record of Vox USA ever publicly promoting the Velvet Underground in any way, which is bizarre considering how often they promoted their other endorsees of widely varying popularity, certainly not just the Beatles, in their various magazine adverts and other promotional campaigns. It's one of the many unfortunate examples of missed opportunities for positive exposure in the history of the band's career. The majority of the troupe stayed at the Castle, a large imitation medieval structure in the Hollywood Hills, often rented by touring musicians for $500 per week. On the first night at the Trip, local band The Mothers of Invention opened the show with their home crowd cheering them on stage and giving them a standing ovation after their set. Later on, despite the venue being packed with celebrities in anticipation of their show, which quickly got their initial 2-week contract extended to 3 weeks, the Velvets played to a divided audience. Some were mesmerized by their radical sound and stunned by the incredible light show, while many others reacted with hostility, booing towards the stage in outrage of the sexual nature of the music, films, and dance choreography.
When we arrived, it was an attack against their way of life. During the Mother's show, Zappa would keep putting us down, like on the mic he would say, "These guys really suck."
In retaliation, when the Velvets left the stage, they leaned their guitars against the amplifiers and turned them all the way up, creating deafening feedback. The Mothers were fired as the opening act due to the animosity between the two bands, and the Modern Folk Quartet were hired as a replacement. Also being considered for subsequent shows were another local and then unsigned band named The Doors. Ray Manzarek, keyboardist of The Doors, recalled, "We were to be the opening act. We were very excited. New York and LA Underground go head to head, so to speak. It would have been momentous. What a double bill."
The image of the band, drugs and deviant sex of some unknown sort, unspecified. We just assumed that it was deviant in some way. Inevitably, what we sang about became permanently affixed to the band, which is odd when you think about it. So anything in the subject material, no matter how remote, must somehow be very intimately bound up in our lifestyle, and to some extent it was true. We were around some pretty interesting people. Our unwillingness, we'll say, to try to contrive an image made it easier for these ideas to be central. There wasn't any counter current of the true image of the Velvet Underground. In fact, there was none.
There was one thing in our thing that was missing from the others. It was rock, it had power. The other stuff doesn't have this power to it that communicates itself instantly in a really visceral way. The other stuff you listen to and you have to conjure it up in your mind. Our stuff could be considered dangerous because it didn't just sit there to be admired or you have to come into it. It went out to you. That's the difference.
Andy Warhol recalled, "After the Velvets opened, a lot of people wondered if they could last the full 3 weeks. And critics wrote things like, the Velvet Underground should go back underground and practice. But the Velvets in their wraparound shades and tight striped pants went right on and played their demented New York music, even though the people just didn't appreciate it. Some of them said it was the most destructive thing they'd ever heard. On opening night, a couple of the Byrds were there, and Jim Morrison, who looked really intrigued. Ryan O'Neill and Mama Cass were there, kicking their heels. We read a great comment by Cher Bono the next day in one of the newspapers, and we picked it up for one of our ads. It will replace nothing, except maybe suicide. Sonny seemed to like it all. He stayed on after she left." It would transpire that they didn't need to worry about filling the club for their entire stint, as it was closed down by the sheriff's office on their third night due to complaints from offended customers. Victoria Cavalieri, who worked at the venue and was serving drinks in the celebrity section the night they opened, remembered Steve McQueen, Jane Fonda, Lee Michaels, as well as members of the Daily Flash, The Leaves, and Love all being in attendance that night. She recalled, "Before the first set was over, people started to walk out of the club. People were standing up at their tables booing as they waited their turn to leave. The line for the second show circled the block, but the customers leaving started warning people not to go in. They said the show was vulgar and violent. The line got smaller and smaller until only a handful of people remained. The owners had a 3-week contract with an act that had driven even the club regulars away. The trip was a great place to hang out, but not a big moneymaker, so even a week of lost income would hurt. But 3 weeks meant bankruptcy. The troupe stayed in LA, naturally hoping the club would reopen, but also they had been told by the Musicians' Union that if they stayed in town for the duration of their engagement, they would have to be paid the complete fee.
We had a horrible reputation. Everyone figured we were gay, running around with Warhol and all those whips and stuff. After about a week and a half of waiting for the trip to reopen, I moved to the Tropicana. Faison and Danny were already there, and I'd had enough of Patrick Tilden imitating Bob Dylan's grating speech patterns up at the castle. There wasn't much partying at the castle while we were there because of our reputation. Rumors so sinister were making the rounds on the Strip that hardly anyone had the courage to visit. And those who dared come up, at night, found dark rooms and passageways, lit only by an occasional flickering brazier, strains of music from the acetates of the first album, mutterings, shuffling, and an occasional human form such as Severin Darden gliding by in his monk's attire. I do not exaggerate. At the Tropicana, we partied with the Buffalo Springfield, who were staying there too, and various others from the LA music scene. I rode all over the place on a motorcycle that Kurt Von Meyer lent me, and as often as not, was at the castle anyway. It's just that I wasn't stuck up there.
Partying aside, the band opted to use the free time to finish recording their album at TTG Studios, having finally managed to sign a recording contract with MGM's subsidiary label, Verve Records.
We made the album ourselves, and then took it around because we knew that no one was going to sign us off the streets, and we didn't want any A&R department telling us what songs we should record. We took it to Ahmet Ertegun, and he said, no drug songs. We took it to Elektra, and they said, no viola. Finally, we took it to Tom Wilson, who was at Columbia, and he said to wait until he moved to MGM and we could do whatever we wanted with him on their Verve label, which turned out to be true, and MGM did sign us. They signed the Mothers of Invention at the same time, trying to revamp Verve and go psychedelic or something.
The deal was negotiated between Morrissey, Warhol, and the band's future manager, Steve Sesnick, who was affiliated with an advertising agency that had dealings with some of Andy's work, and became involved with the project on a loose freelance basis, since they already had a contract with Warhol and Morrissey, although privately, he was in fact seeking to become their new manager. The band recorded entirely new takes of Heroin, I'm Waiting for the Man, and Venus in Furs at TTG, as Tom felt they were the standout tracks, but also believed the earlier Scepter takes could be improved on. Steve Sesnick claimed that he arranged for them to play at Bill Graham's Fillmore in San Francisco at the end of May, although Warhol remembered it being Graham repeatedly calling Morrissey, trying to book them on a bill with the Mothers of Invention and Jefferson Airplane, in order to use Andy's name in the advertising to attract more audience and make the show a sellout.
Bill Graham made so much money that weekend we played at the Fillmore that he didn't believe it. We arrived at a time before Jefferson Airplane was known to anyone. They didn't even have Grace Slick yet. Everyone was nowhere at that time, the Mothers and of course ourselves. Warhol was the name at the time that made an impact with the public. There were so many people capitalizing on our show that night. Graham was an insane slob, totally beneath my abilities to observe. The day I arrived at his club, I was thrown out. I just walked in with my guitar and he said, "You get out of here." They told him, "You've lost your mind. He's playing here tonight." He said, "Get out, you son of a bitch." I wish I had. When we showed up, he had a slide projector with a picture of the moon. We said, "That's not a light show, Bill. Sorry." Marshall McLuhan gave us credit for inventing the light show in The Medium is the Message. There's a photo. He's the only one. It was nice of him. He showed the group that did it all. Graham didn't, nor did any San Francisco entrepreneur. I should have graduated in '66, but I was 8 credits shy. I made 3 round trips by plane from the West Coast to take finals in the space of a week, or 10 days or so, which kind of wore me out. Mentally, I was far removed from college life. I didn't want to get a low grade, so I just withdrew.
Tensions at the Fillmore finally came to a head when Paul decided to deliberately wind up Bill by lecturing him about the benefits of heroin use while eating a tangerine, and unconsciously dropping the peels on his floor. Bitter arguments ensued in the club, and later Gerard was arrested for carrying an offensive weapon, his whip, and spent the night in jail. The city clearly felt the same way about the Velvets as the entire troupe did about the hippies. It was time to leave.
We came out of there as an unshakable entity. We were going back to New York to greener pastures, supposedly, but when we got back, our club was gone. Danny Williams stayed behind to design a light show. He went from there directly to Chicago to set up our show at Poor Richard's.
At the beginning of June, Nico took off for a modelling assignment in Spain, and Lou contracted hepatitis and went into Beth Israel Hospital in New York, meaning neither could make the upcoming dates that Steve Sesnick had booked for the group at Poor Richard's in Chicago. Angus MacLise was brought back in to play percussion, Maureen switched over to bass, and Sterling and John took over the vocals. Gerard, Andy and Angus went to visit Lou in hospital before they flew out to Chicago, and Lou told Angus, "Just remember you're only coming back for 2 weeks. I don't want you to get any idea that you're coming back into the group again."
Lou was always nice like that. Angus had originally left the group because he anticipated all kinds of compromises that would have to be made. When he finally did play with us out in Chicago, he discovered that he had made a mistake. That was a sad moment. I said, "It's too late, Angus. Unless Maureen quits, she remains." Everybody thought we'd be a flop without Lou, but we were great. We were held over for a second week, which was at least as successful as the first. Playboy hired us to play in the club at a noon fashion show. The clothing was given to us by a mod shop in Old Town. It was written up with a picture in their VIP magazine. We went on Studs Terkel's radio show and all that sort of on-tour stuff. We didn't lay low just because we didn't have Lou, Nico, or Andy. On the contrary, I would say we made ourselves rather conspicuous.
Here's an excerpt of Studs Terkel's radio interview, recorded on June 23, 1966.
Michelle Williams saying, "You're in any kind of horror you want to imagine, from police state to madhouse. And then finally, after this horror is over, eventually the reverberations in your ears stop. But what do you do with what you still hear in your brain? The flowers of evil are in full bloom with the exploding plastic inevitable. Let's hope it's killed before it spreads." You like this review?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
You like this
very
review?
famous.
This is see, we have the two films. They're seen simultaneously. And then the Velvet Underground appears live now as the film's run. And on the stage, we have an electric viola.
Yeah.
This is new in the world of music, is it?
Yes, sort of.
Oh, yes. In the world of rock and roll music, pop music.
And Sterling Morrison plays electric guitar.
Yeah.
Then there's an amplified bass too, isn't there?
Yeah. And there's electric organ, and there's
electric organ.
also a whole series of drums. What are Angus's drums called?
He's playing a doumbak, this thing called a chamalum,
Chamlum.
which has strings.
So this all goes on
Yeah.
as the audience endures, doesn't it? In a
And
way.
then four different films going back of them, back of the
And then
musicians.
I think they eventually
Plus the
feel the
lights.
pulsating beats of the whole thing, and they don't endure it anymore, but they become part of the entire show. They're all moving with the driving music.
The strobe lights are flickering on and off in a certain way. as though
They're
the-
set. There's a certain time set for the strobes.
You know, I was trying to sing to myself, "Blow, fuse, blow." I wanted the fuse to go out because I want to be sort of God in reverse as I let that
But
be
the
darkness.
music would still
you know,
be going.
this looks like the end of the world to me, utter madness.
No other rock and roll groups offer you this. I mean, you go to see a concert, and if you don't particularly like a song, you're just stuck with it in your own imagination, and you have to sit there and wonder why I spent $5.50 to sit in this room. Where we're offering you movies, we're offering light, dancing, and there's just more to do.
Does the audience every now and then react violently toward you? Oh, do they? Has anybody thrown glasses at
Well,
you?
it's not armed resistance.
They make remarks and shout and they clap, or some people run screaming from the audience. At
Some
them.
people
It's
lay
good
on the
idea.
They'd
floor
lay down on
and
the
roll
floor and
around
just
on the floor.
screamed, and
Some of those are good
they're good
reactions.
reactions.
In what way are they good? You mean
Because they're getting right into the experience themselves and freaking out.
Right.
freaking out?
Yeah.
Is it so?
They're doing something that
They're
other mediums
becoming
haven't
free
brought
with
out of them.
themselves.
The show does something that has this reaction of people, not on account of the films themselves exactly, but on account of the music itself. Like the show is devised to display the music. It's all original music, the Velvet Underground. And some of it is very conventional. We usually begin with some conventional songs and then go into the stranger ones and end with what you saw.
In any case, it doesn't work. We start off with conventional songs, and they have sweetness in life, supposedly. And then we're accused of decadence when we do that. They say the sweetness is there, but it's one of corruption and decay.
Yes, that's true.
Somebody said that.
They read into the nice songs all sorts of evil and perverse intentions.
Do you think that what you're doing here, EPI, could have been, say, possible? Anybody, say 30 years ago, let's talk about artistic standards being broken down to a great extent. There's been what is good and what is bad. Do you think this would have been possible 30 years ago?
It was claimed that you could have done it in Germany in the 30s.
That's
where
interesting.
there were no extant standards.
Hey, wait a minute. You're starting a very interesting point here. This program could have been done in Germany in the 30s.
Well, that's not my personal opinion.
But
Someone claimed it.
It's an interesting point. For those who are curious to see the exploding plastic inevitable, it's at Poor Richard's. We trust Poor Richards will be less poor as a result, too. So we thank our 5 guests, Yule superstar, Gerard Malanga, a veteran of both stage and screen.
Good.
Steve Sesnick, Paul Morrissey, the articulate Paul here, and Sterling Morrison of the electric guitar. Thank you very much.
Tom Wilson arranged the release of the song All Tomorrow's Parties, taken from the album recordings but halved in length, as a single backed with I'll Be Your Mirror in July ahead of the release of the album, but it failed to make the charts. At some point between their dates in Chicago and Provincetown during July, the band stopped off for coffee someplace with Faze on and forgot to lock up the station wagon. When they came back, they found that Sterling's Gibson Les Paul Standard had been stolen from inside. Sterling was naturally devastated to have lost his favourite guitar, but took it on the chin and replaced it with a Sunburst Fender Stratocaster. Later that month, Danny Williams visited Massachusetts for a family event. One night after dinner, he told them that he needed some air. He borrowed his mother's car, drove off, and was never seen again. The car was later found parked near the water at Cape Ann, but his body was never found, and nobody knows for certain what actually happened to him. Danny's niece, Esther Robinson, later explored her uncle's story in her 2007 film A Walk into the Sea, which features several excerpts of unearthed films he had made, one of which contains footage of the Velvets rehearsing at the factory in early 1966. Danny was a crucial part of the Velvets' multimedia shows and a promising young filmmaker who has sadly been much forgotten since.
Danny was involved in a factory power struggle with Paul Morrissey, and Paul won. At issue was who was going to be Andy's technical advisor. The struggle was so intense by Chicago that Danny and Paul actually came to blows over an extension cord. Danny wanted it for the lights, and Paul wanted it for the projectors. The only way I could deal with that was to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but perhaps Danny felt that he had no support in the group either, which wasn't the case. Danny was excellent at what he did, and a very hard worker.
When the band returned to New York, they did not resume their residency at the Dom straight away due to having other engagements booked, but when Paul and Andy did eventually attempt to secure a lease for the fall in September, they found that it had already been bought by Albert Grossman, who was now managing the venue under a new name, the Balloon Farm, with Charlie Rothschild. Al had been informed about the success of the EPI shows back in April by Charlie, and decided to bribe the owners of the venue to break their gentleman's agreement with Andy and Paul. Paul Morrissey recalled, Rothschild had the nerve to say, "Would the Velvets like to open the Balloon Farm, Mr. Grossman's club?" It was kind of humiliating to have to go back under those circumstances, especially for me, but Andy wasn't going to keep handing the Velvets money to pay bills. They reluctantly accepted, needing the income since they still hadn't been paid for their engagement at the Trip, and funds were generally low already due to other touring expenses, but the incensed band soon decided to refuse.
What we found repellent was that we were back in what we considered to be our ballroom, and even worse, we were working for the people who had taken it from us. We did have some valuable property, so I discovered early in life that when you have something valuable, someone is going to try and take it away from you unless you go around knowing things. I couldn't believe something like that could happen, and if you bothered to sue or do anything like that, by the time it came up in the courts, you'd passed caring. Albert Grossman is a criminal. Bob Dylan is by extension a criminal for having such representation. Given a choice between working for them and nothing, we chose nothing. Like so many other decisions, flukes, or whatever in our history, one can hardly speculate about the course of events had this incident not occurred. By August, the album was ready, and we all went crazy wondering what was happening with the tapes. Zappa and his manager wanted to be the first with the release on Verve, and we were totally naive. We didn't have a manager who would go to the record company every day and just drag the whole thing through the mud.
What the band really needed was a hard-headed businessman, but they were devoted to Andy and could not see without future hindsight that the peak of their collaboration had passed. Steve Sesnick would persist in trying to persuade the band to let him be their manager, but the band were entirely focused on getting the album released, and Andy had already set out to design the cover for them. It was decided that the cover would have a silkscreen image of a banana as a sticker, which could be peeled off to reveal another silkscreen image of a naked banana underneath it. The decision was made between Lou and Andy, with the soft sexual reference being clear, but playful rather than explicit. Tensions were beginning to rise between the two also, however, as Lou and the rest of the band were becoming increasingly disinterested in performing until their record was released. Andy suggested to Lou he should quit being lazy and write more songs. Tom Wilson had also requested another song for Nico to sing, feeling that the album needed one more song with her vocals to help balance it out. Lou responded by writing Sunday Morning, a song about paranoia, a subject suggested by Andy, which the band recorded at Mayfair Studios on 7th Avenue in November. What Tom had in mind was a Christmas single that could potentially get the band some airplay, but also draw more attention towards the album. During the sessions, however, Lou refused to allow Nico to have the spotlight and insisted, "I'm gonna sing this." Tom was left speechless by Lou's arrogance, given that Nico's singing had been the whole purpose of the session, and she'd already sang the song live a few times, but his bold assertion was proved to be right after he provided the song with perhaps the most delicate and graceful vocal performance of his long career, complementing the lush Phil Spector-like sound of the music perfectly. Sterling claimed that the bass guitar slide at the beginning of the song was deliberately lifted from Monday Monday by the Mamas and the Papas.
Like an elbow in the ribs, here comes a song about paranoia, ha ha.
Nico was called in to add backing vocals, and the song was submitted for release the following month, as well as being added as the opening track to the album, which was finally considered complete. On November 20th, they played a mod wedding event, a legitimate wedding with a marriage license and judge, but with a bizarre ceremony to say the least, staged at the Carnaby Street Fun Festival at the State Fair Coliseum in Detroit, witnessed by 4,500 people and planned by Andy Warhol. Andy gave away the bride to the tune of the Velvets performing Here Comes the Bride, after which they played a full set with the Yardbirds appearing after them. Maureen Tucker recalled, "That was lunacy. We were playing, but Dave Faison was recruited to beat the hell out of a car with a sledgehammer during the ceremony and during our set. I don't know what the significance was. The meaning of the DeSoto destruction was left unsaid. The car sported a sticker that read, 'If it moves, fondle it.'"
We never did anything to ingratiate ourselves with the media, through lack of interest more than arrogance. I was convinced that if it was going to happen, it would happen anyway. We were all really contemptuous of hype. Crusading was the word I always used. It took absolute conviction that we were doing the right thing. That was the only thing that could sustain us. In the fall of 1966, John and I got a place on East 10th Street, just east of First Avenue. Shortly thereafter, Lou also got a place on East 10th, just west of First Avenue, so the three of us were living about 50 yards apart. We would have lived together if we could have found a place large enough. We were hanging around together day and night.
Sunday Morning was released in December 1966 as planned, but just like the previous single, it failed to chart. Dave Faison quit being their road manager in late 1966 because he needed more money. Phil Shear, a roommate of Lou's for a while at Syracuse who sometimes played bass with him, took over in 1967. Lou's frustration towards Andy was becoming intense, not only because it was clear to Lou that Nico was the one Paul Morrissey and Tom Wilson really wanted to put the spotlight on, but also because MGM Verve appeared to be giving the Mothers of Invention all the publicity they possibly could, while hardly promoting the Velvets whatsoever. Andy was not an experienced rock and roll band manager like Herb Cohen, for example, the Mothers' manager. Their debut album, Freak Out, had already been released back in June, yet the Velvet's debut album release was once again delayed until March of 1967, this time because a special machine had to be made to produce the peelable cover. Lou and Sterling became suspicious that their material was being deliberately censored.
I don't know how many times we'd go play somewhere and people would say, "Oh, we love your stuff, but we can't find your record." We heard that all over the place, and they didn't distribute it. I don't know why. I don't know, there was a number of songs that weren't controversial or horrifying at the time that were pretty damn good, I thought. So I think MGM was just sort of trying to keep us off the streets. Sign them up and let them make a record and let them go on their way. You know, that's almost the way it felt. Sterling used to say that they signed us so we couldn't compete with Zappa. They'd push them, and now we were signed, we couldn't have a record for someone else, and they just shut us up, in other words.
Nevertheless, The Velvet Underground and Nico was finally released by Verve in March of 1967. The peelable banana cover looked just as good as imagined, and the record sounded exactly how the group intended it to, thanks to Andy's efforts to ensure that the music remained unaltered by the record company, hence his credit as producer. Tom Wilson's suggestion to re-record the more prominent tracks was also well advised, but would the efforts of all concerned be enough for the record to be a success?
I think the effect of Venus in Furs is that musically it's so shocking. I think that's what frightened people. That could have been a song about anything. But that always has been my favorite song. That's the, if I had to say, show me one thing that you do differently than anybody else ever did, I would drag out Venus in Furs. I say, you show me whoever sounded like this.
Kiss the boot of shiny, shiny leather. Shiny leather in the dark. Tongue the thongs, the belt that does await you. Strike, dear mistress, and cure his heart.
We sort of sought after certain nooks and crannies of human experience that most people were a little squeamish about thinking about. I certainly didn't want to be reminded about it in an entertainment field. The realism involved in all of it was used very effectively against our becoming popular. The two were never really meant to coexist.
country all covered with sleep, where the black angel did weep. Not on no city street, and he's gone to choose.
Advertising for the album was refused by the fledgling FM rock radio trip in NYC. AM advertising was likewise out of the question. Perhaps a restraint of trade suits was in order, but we just grit our teeth. WBAI, Bob Fass, was the only one who played the album. He would air a few cuts a night for a long time. Then we had a falling out over a bail fund benefit at Tompkins Park, and even he wouldn't play it. The silence was complete thereafter on the home front.
As if losing the Dom, having issues with their manager, producer, and record label, and their record being banned on all New York radio stations wasn't enough, then there was Eric Emerson. Being one of the personnel who joined the EPI as a dancer and later appeared in some of Andy's films, Eric's picture was shown in the image used on the reverse cover of the album sleeve because he was in one of the films projected onto the wall behind the stage. He refused to sign a release for MGM and threatened to sue them if he was not paid.
The crowning moment of doom. The whole Eric business was a tragic fiasco for us, and proves what idiots there were at MGM. They responded by pulling the album off the shelves immediately, and kept it off the shelves for a couple of months while they fooled around with the stickers over Eric's picture, and then finally the airbrush. The album thus vanished from the charts almost immediately in June 1967, just when it was about to enter the top 100. It never returned to the charts. As for Eric, he never got any money as far as I know. I don't think that anyone has ever bothered to complain about the destructive audacity of his action.
After some poorly attended nights at the Sokol Hall, aka the Gymnasium, in an attempt to revamp the EPI during the spring of 1967, the Velvet Underground, the only band who spoke for the city, refused to play in New York thereafter and did not perform live in the city again until the summer of 1970.
It was all very informal. We stopped working for a while, just refusing to do anything. A rational response would have been to rent a hall in New York and play there every night. Instead, we said, fuck 'em. If they're not going to play us on the radio, we're not going to play here. It was a good way to generate mystique, but that wasn't our intention. We wanted to punish New York.
The band performed for the first time with no EPI lights or films since before they signed with Andy, at a Mersey Cunningham benefit at Philip Johnson's Glass House in Connecticut on June 3, 1967. The event was filmed by Klaus Wildenhahn for a documentary called 498 3rd Avenue, which includes clips of the large audience dancing and really getting into the band's music, as Sterling takes a blistering solo during I'm Waiting for the Man, but sadly no clear footage of the band was shot.
The best nights are when you feel you can drop out without affecting the band, that what you do doesn't really matter. The song is going by itself, and it has its own momentum. You can relax and do what you feel like doing. The worst nights are the nights when you feel like the juggler in a circus. You have all that stuff up in the air, and if your concentration wavers for a moment, the whole thing is going to collapse. Those are disastrous nights.
On the way back to New York after that show, the band all discussed hiring Steve Sesnick as their new manager. They had been approached by businessmen at the show, but felt that Steve's enthusiasm, persistence, and like-minded personality was more what they needed. He had not only proved that he was dedicated, but they also got on really well with him. Lou subsequently had a meeting with Andy, during which he was asked, "Do you want to keep playing museums and art festivals, or do you want to start moving into other areas? Don't you think you should think about it?" Lou thought about it and immediately fired him as their manager, believing that was the first thing to do if the band indeed were to progress above those things. He later recalled that Andy was furious and called him a rat, apparently the worst word he could think of at that moment. Andy, however, claimed it wasn't that dramatic. In any case, Steve was hired, the exploding plastic inevitable was no more, and the group severed their ties with Andy and Paul. It had become apparent that they no longer needed the multimedia show to drive a crowd, as their own following, independent of the show, was growing. Their performances were also becoming increasingly high energy. Many of the earlier songs still being played in the set were now being played at higher volume, with faster tempo and intensity, and they were beginning to establish themselves as a dance band. In late June, while the band had some dates booked at Le Cave in Cleveland, Ohio, they recorded a performance of I Guess I'm Falling in Love for the local TV show Upbeat. The videotapes of this performance have never been found and are presumed to have been either stolen or recorded over. Audio, however, does survive in the form of a tape recording taken directly from TV set speakers that emerged on YouTube some years ago, where Lou can be heard improvising the lyrics.
Terrific song featuring a fuzz solo by yours truly, but we almost never went on those shows because you had to be a pop success, which we never were.
Hey now, babe, I guess I'm falling in love. I got my penny, and it ran to had it down on my feet. Hey, sweet, sweet, I guess I'm falling in love. I got my penny, and it ready. I carry it down in my shoes. I get it ready, ready. I said that it's gonna work out fine. It's gonna work out alright. Yeah.
Steve had recently met Brian Epstein, manager of the Beatles, who had been given a copy of The Velvet Underground and Nico by Danny Fields, which he took on holiday to Acapulco, Mexico with his lover that summer and played over and over on the beach with a portable turntable because it was the only record that they had with them. A genuine fan of the music, Epstein expressed interest in buying their publishing rights and also offered to arrange an international tour of Europe, which the Velvets were naturally excited about and agreed to do. But just before the contracts were signed, Brian died in August of 1967, closing that channel entirely. Though the band continued to live in New York, Boston quickly became their new home. They had begun playing the Boston Tea Party, an old synagogue that was converted into a concert venue in January 1967, located at 53 Berkeley Street, which Steve Sesnick was a partner in ownership of and did all the bookings for. The band also became good friends with the manager of the venue, Steve Nelson.
Well, we played there a lot, so they would know the songs because they came back. That would be part of it. Also, I think another thing is that New York, as far as I know at the time, didn't have places like the Tea Party. Other cities, almost everyone had an old dance hall that was just a big empty place. All they had was Coke and popcorn or something. It cost $3, and that was pretty darn cheap even then. So younger kids could go too, and there was no liquor, so you didn't have to have a 21-year-old thing. And I've often thought that, what a shame it is, because it really was. Every city had at least one of those running as a club, and they were just fun places to be, because there was no liquor. 15-year-olds could be in there as well as 30-year-olds. And I don't think New York had any like that, and they were very conducive to the kind of audience that we wanted or would want to come see us, I think.
The enthusiasm from the audience. Watching Mo, watching Sterling, it wasn't unequal. It was 4 members of the Velvet Underground getting the attention evenly. I think it's just when people talk about the past, they're not given the credence that John and Lou are. And I can understand why, but it didn't have anything to do with the real thing when it was happening.
One person who would get to see them perform at the Boston Tea Party between 60 and 70 times in his later estimation was a young Jonathan Richman.
I couldn't hit it sideways. I couldn't hit it sideways. Just like Sister Ray said, suck to me. Rosie and Miss Rayon, waiting for her booster. Who's back from Alabama? It's just a fucking leather. He didn't have the time. Sucking on his ding dong. Sucking on his ding dong. Just like Sister Ray said, I'm searching for my main line. I couldn't hit it sideways. I couldn't hit it sideways. Just like Sister Ray says, suck to me.
Nico had been billed to appear with them at their first show at the Tea Party, but she turned up late, almost at the end of their performance, and Lou refused to let her on stage, bringing an end to their collaboration.
There was always a problem of what to do with Nico when there was a song that wasn't one of her songs. She wasn't playing an instrument. She wanted to sing all the songs. It was really awkward about what to do. It wasn't that we wanted to get her out of the group.
Nico went off to the West Coast to attend the Monterey Pop Festival with Brian Jones and pursue her solo career. Meanwhile, the Velvets went into Mayfair Studios in New York to record their second album.
The so-called Summer of Love was a lovely summer in New York City, for in addition to the usual eastward migration of the vapid chic set, comprising socialites, Arabs, and whatnot, to the Hamptons, an even more welcome exodus took place westward to San Francisco. Inspired by media hype and encouraged by shameless, deceitful songs on the radio, teenage ninnies flocked from Middle America out to the coast. Hot on their heels came a predatory mob from NYC. Every creep, every degenerate, every hustler, booster, and rip-off artist, every wasted weirdo packed up his or her clap, crabs, and cons and headed off to the promised land. This sleazy legion then descended upon the hapless hippies and their dupes in San Francisco, and the rest, as the saying goes, is history. But behind them in Manhattan, all was suddenly quiet, clean, and beautiful, like the world of Noah after the flood. If you hadn't seen a particular lowlife for a while, you knew that they were all there, and had a pretty good idea of what they were up to. And so at the height of the Summer of Love, we stayed in NYC and recorded White Light, White Heat, an orgasm of our own.
White Light, White Heat was a real frustration because we wanted to do something electronic and energetic. And we had the energy and we had the electronics. What we didn't take into account was whether or not it could be recorded. If we went into a studio now and did White Light, White Heat, it would work because they have the equipment. Then they didn't. So there's an incredible leakage from track to track. There were ways we could have done it if we'd all played individually, but we didn't like to. We liked to play simultaneously and use voiceover live a lot of times. So we didn't know that the album was doomed until we actually mixed it down.
We liked the material, so in that sense it was a success, but we anticipated a much better sound, something a lot cleaner and crisper, that would just fly out at you, and it didn't happen. What I wanted was the sound I heard in the studio being played back, separate tracks through separate speakers. That's what I wanted to hear. In fact, all our efforts to make it happen were ironic. We made just the opposite happen. The louder we played, the quieter they had to do the mastering. I quit the group for a couple of days because I thought they chose the wrong mix for I Heard Her Call My Name, one of our best songs that was completely ruined in the studio. There would be a big brawl over which take to use. Of course, everyone would opt for the takes where they sounded best. It was a tremendous hassle, so on Sister Ray, we solved the problem by deciding that there was only going to be one take. Come what may, this will be the released version. If you don't feel good about your performance today, too bad. No excuses or druthers. We could have gone back and done the whole album over, but we wouldn't have gained anything. We just learned our lesson and maybe warned other groups. Avoid these excesses. I think basically the band had 3 uncontrollable personalities, and if you throw drugs into the confusion, then you really have problems. But Mo took a quiet role in our conflicts. She always said there was no reasoning with any of us, that we were all crazy and there was no sense in arguing.
When you go on the road and you suddenly realize the people that were opening for you 6 months ago are now on the charts and they're headlining, and you're still struggling around the country, not having the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, not having Andy Warhol, but now a road band who are having difficulty booking themselves in the kind of venues that you've been used to, and being fairly directionless and faced with all the chickens coming home to roost of a career that went off into the ozone layer for a while. But it didn't stop there. It went on and on and on beyond that into the road, which had its own debilitating effect on everybody's psychological well-being. All of that stuff ended up eating away at us, and that was part of the slow erosion of our musical camaraderie.
Could not go to the practices because they were so mean to each other. I couldn't handle that. I wanted Sterling and Lou to be nice, or as they say in Levittown, make nice, but no. Although they both loved each other and worked great together. Who knows what those sparks were about? All I can say is there was a lot of tension, but it seemed to be necessary to make the music.
We may have been dragging each other off a cliff, but we were all definitely going in the same direction. Our lives were chaos. That's what's reflected in that record. Things were insane day in and day out. The people we knew, the excesses of all sorts. For a long time, we were living in various places, afraid of the police. At the height of my musical career, I had no permanent address. I see that reflected in there. In the fall of 1967, I moved in with Martha and her brother Tom on East 2nd Street. John moved in with Betsy at the Chelsea somewhere around this time, and Lou was here and there mostly on Perry Street, and later at the loft on 7th Ave and 31st Street. Maureen was living on 5th Avenue and 9th Street.
Phil Shear quit in late 1967 and was replaced by Hans Onsager, who would serve as the band's road manager until the very end. Despite no longer being their manager, Andy Warhol was still on good terms with Lou and the rest of the band, and occasionally got involved with goings-on. He also contributed the idea for the White Light, White Heat album cover concept, a close-up photograph of a tattoo on Billy Linick's upper arm. The new album, the total antithesis of West Coast hippie culture, was released by Verve in January 1968, but once again, it was poorly promoted and received very little airplay. The title track was also released as a single, but just like all previous attempts was not successful and was even banned from most major radio stations across the USA.
After the White Light, White Heat era, the album came out and we played and we were having good times in the band. So that's why it was so strange, the that Lou should suddenly want John out. I don't remember any reason really being given, except that this would be some general statement that he couldn't stand, playing with John anymore, for umpteen inexpressible reasons. I always had my own weird interpretations. I don't recall Lou ever giving an exact reason for not wanting John there. But John was playing great, so it wasn't anything that he was falling down musically. His personal habits were commendable. He was running around with Betsy Johnson and was very well dressed. So he was doing fine. A true story of successful rehabilitation of a classical musician. So I don't know. Maybe Lou got jealous. I would attribute it to something like that. Not that John was easy to work with, but was Lou? Was I?
I don't see 1968 as a black year at all, except that we ended it without Cale, an event that blackened it as much as possible, to be sure. I considered it our best year. Our touring was successful, and our playing was excellent. Our struggles to succeed on our own terms, once directed outwards at audiences, record execs, radio stations, and whatnot, perhaps turned inward towards the group. John and I were very happy with Sister Ray-type music. It's a good dance song. Lou played heavy emphasis on lyrics, while Cale and I were more interested in blasting the house down. We had just signed an endorsement deal with Acoustic, so we had terrific amps and equipment, but John decided he did not want their bass amp. It was a problem for all bands then because the bass amp technology wasn't good. Instead, he wanted a component amp. It cost us thousands to build this goddamn thing, and then it doesn't work. So that was an irritation, but that's about the only quirky thing he did. In August, Lou called me and asked me to meet him at the Riviera Café in the West Village. When I got there, Maureen was also present. Lou had called a meeting to announce John was out of the band. I said, "You mean out for today or for this week?" And Lou said, "No, he's out." I said that we were the band, that it was graven on the tablets. So then a long and bitter argument ensued, with much banging on tables. I was enraged. To me it was unthinkable. I really laid into Lou, and finally he said, "You don't go for it. All right, the band is dissolved." Now I could say that it was more important to keep the band together than to worry about Cale, but that wasn't really what decided me. I just wanted to keep doing it, so finally I weighed my self-interest against Cale's interests and sold him out.
John Cale recalled, "Lou and I eventually found the group too small for the both of us, and so I left." Steve Sesnick recalled, "I think it was a relief for everybody concerned. I never lost a night's sleep, except with John. That was a very critical incident, and we felt badly about it, but there was nothing that could be done to stop it. It was certainly of no relief at all, however, to a furious Sterling Morrison."
I don't think I displayed very good character in all of that. In fact, I didn't. The band was never the same for me after. I should have quit or at least called the bluff. I sat back and allowed myself to watch John Cale leave. I thought it was much easier to go along being the Velvet Underground than being nothing by siding with John. This was Lou's scheme, and he gets the blame for it. But I get the blame for complicity. One friend said Lou always told him he wanted to be a solo star. Lou never confided that to us, but John and I always knew that he really wanted some kind of recognition apart from the band. John wanted to do something original and different. I love Lou, but he has what must be a fragmented personality, so you're never too sure under any conditions what you're going to have to deal with. Will he be boyishly charming, naive, and if he is, then you have to figure out what's stoking the fire. What drug is he on, or what mad diet? He had all sorts of strange dietary theories. He'd eat nothing, live on wheat husks. He was always trying to move, mentally and spiritually, to some place where no one had ever gotten before. There are a lot of songs that I should have co-authorship on. And the same holds true for John Cale. The publishing company was called Three Prong because there were three of us involved. I'm the last person to deny Lou's immense contribution, and he's the best songwriter of the three of us. But he wanted all the credit. He wanted it more than we did, and he got it, to keep the peace. We had musical differences from the first minute we were in a room together, but that made the band good. If you have three ideas that fight for dominance, that's a dynamic process. That's what the Velvet Underground was.
John Cale recalled, "I had often assumed Sterling and Lou saw eye to eye about things, and that couldn't have been further from the truth. Sterling was very angry with Lou about overseeing the demise of the band. I don't know whether Sterling was aware of what Lou was doing, but the first part of the plan was when Steve Sesnick showed up and got rid of Andy Warhol. Things got worse with Sesnick aboard because he got in the middle of everybody and started turning the screws. He told the band, 'This is Lou's band, and you do what he says.' The next step in the plan was to say Cale's out. Whatever power Mo and Sterling had in the band was completely erased. All they could do was follow, and it went nowhere. It was grinding Sterling's nose in it."
I still want John to make some serious accomplishments in classical music. I would like to see him employ his training in the way it was originally directed. He is so sharp as a musician. Anybody can play three-chord rock and roll, but I would like to see him just sit down and do serious music. He should be writing chamber music and all the rest of it, however weird he wants to, and for whatever ridiculous assortment of instruments. Doug Yule was a good bass player, but we moved towards unanimity of opinion, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Doug Yule was a familiar face to the band, having attended some of their shows in Boston. Sterling had stayed at his River Street apartment off Central Square in Cambridge numerous times while the band were playing at the Tea Party. Hans Onsegar had also invested some money unsuccessfully in Glass Menagerie, a band that Doug had previously played in, so given it was known he was a good player, he was an obvious good choice as a replacement after John left.
Astrology was all the rage, and when John was fired, or when he left, Sesnick wanted a Pisces, and he wanted somebody who was more manageable than John was, because John had a strong personality, and which is part of the conflict between him and Lou. Sesnick called on a Thursday night. He said, "Do you want to join the band?" I said, "Great." He said, "Can you come down right away to New York?" I said, "Okay." Dick Chandler was just leaving, literally, to drive to New York. So I went and got my stuff together and went down and got in his Volkswagen, which didn't have heat. And we drove down, this was like October. Drove down to New York, and I met Steve and Lou at Max's Kansas City. And as I recall, Sterling was there too. Sat, we talked, this is the deal. I said, great. They said, the only catch is, would you mind playing bass? And I said, no, that's fine. So I went home with Lou, I think, and stayed in his loft, and we started learning songs and played Le Cave that Friday and Saturday. The first few gigs were very intense because I was trying to remember the tunes. I mean, I just learned the tunes and trying to keep it all straight and, you know, do what had to be done. And the band was very supportive. They were really great, you know. There was a lot going on for me, you know. It was a lot happening, so it was very intense.
Maureen Tucker recalled, "It was fine with me. I liked him. My concern was that we didn't really know him. I went to Louis' loft on 28th and 7th by Penn Station to help rehearse one evening. Doug had just worked out a bass part to Jesus, and when I came in, Louis said, 'Listen to this, it's great, it's great.' And I thought, oh God, don't swell this kid's head before he even gets out in the street. I'm not quite sure why that hit me so vividly." The band resumed their touring for only a month before spontaneously deciding to record an album whilst in LA.
An odd incident preceded the third album in that all our electronic gizmos that were stored and carried in ammunition boxes, you could kick them around and nothing would happen to them, were stolen at JFK Airport in New York when we were on our way to the West Coast to do the album. Rather than try to replace them, we thought about what we could do without them. I didn't mind playing cleaner. I bought a Fender 12-string, and Lou liked it, so he bought one. We knew we were going to play some songs in the studio, but we didn't know which they would be, and there was never any way to tell. Cale's departure allowed Lou Reed's sensitive, meaningful side to hold sway. Why do you think Pale Blue Eyes happened on the third album, with Cale out of there? That's a song about Lou's old girlfriend in Syracuse University. I said, Lou, if I wrote a song like that, I wouldn't make you play it. My position on that album was one of acquiescence. All I mean is that I didn't argue hotly about this or that feature in the album. My contribution was as much as ever, probably more even, but I just didn't try to get my own way all the time. Perhaps the Cale business left me all argued out, or perhaps I just didn't feel that strongly about the material, one way or the other. The main reason for Doug doing the vocals is that Lou's voice wasn't up to it when we were in the studio. Lou has never had a durable voice, which is one of the reasons why we tried not to play too often. A long series of one-nighters would be out of the question. Lou had used up his voice at the Whiskey, where we played during the time we were making the album. Since we wanted to get the album finished and since Doug could sing, he got the nod.
On the third album, the vocals were shared around more, I think predominantly because it just took some of the load off him, and it was something different to do. I sang Candy Says on that, and it was, I didn't know I was going to sing that song until we were doing the vocals, and he sang one, and he came back and said, why don't you sing one, you know? And the same thing with Maureen. I think it was just, I wonder what it would sound like if you sang it, Maureen, you know, that kind of thing. It happened more later, you know, it was shared even more, because it's fun to not always sing. It's fun to kick back and, you know, play the guitar and just sing the harmony and not have to be the lead voice. I found that out later when Lou left and I was playing and singing all the leads, and I didn't like it. You know, it wasn't as much fun. The Grey album is my favorite is because of the sound of it. There was a way that the group was together. It was very comfortable and, you know, tight, and it was really a band And the reason I like that album is because it sounds like a band. It has that feeling to it, you know.
During the recording sessions for the third album at TTG Studios, the band ran into Jimi Hendrix, who was also recording there at the time.
Jimi Hendrix once expressed disbelief to us that we weren't bigger than we were. And said, well, how can we? You know, we're not in the radio. You have an unfair advantage. They play your records.
The band live was very exciting, and a lot of that was translated into recordings, but I don't think the recordings ever equaled what the band could do live. I remember being in the Whiskey A Go-Go in '69, I think, and Jimi Hendrix came up afterwards, and he had been, apparently, I didn't see this, apparently he'd been just standing on the table and jumping up and down and screaming during the set. and he just came up and said, you guys, you really know how to rock, you know. And when the first time I saw them, that was what blew me away. When I saw them, it was, you know, just flat out knocked down rock and roll.
The band's self-titled third album, The Velvet Underground, was released by MGM, Verve's parent label, in March 1969. The cover was once again a photo taken by Billy Linick, this time simply of the band sitting on the couch at the factory having a conversation. According to Doug, it was Steve's idea that the less said about something, the easier it is to change, referring to the discrete credits on the reverse cover of the album and the convoluted picture of Reed by himself, as opposed to the whole band, as well as reflecting on the loss of John Cale and the desire to move labels. The future of the Velvet Underground was seeming quite uncertain, despite there being little suggestion of their precarious situation in the calm, intimate and ethereal sound of the new album, which was a dramatic shift from the chaos of the previous two. Another side to the band was clearly being revealed, but would this new direction bring them success?
Images develop in and of themselves. So once people decide that the Velvet Underground is in fact a depraved group of junkies, whatever their musical talents, then people are always waiting for you to do something strange. But in fact, we had good table manners, and paid our hotel bills, didn't break furniture, as people with middle-class upbringings might be expected to do. If we'd done some insane things, it probably would have helped.
Critical reviews of the new record were good, and with Steve's persistence in pushing MGM, they did get slightly more promotion than with their previous two albums. However, compared to groups on the label that the company saw as less provocative, the record was still not widely distributed, so even if people wanted to buy it, they often weren't able. Maureen Tucker recalled, "I remember specifically we played in St. Louis long enough after the album came out that it should have been in the stores. We had never played there before and expected 30 people to show up, and a couple of thousand people showed up. The guy who owned the club was ecstatic. If MGM had pushed the albums and nobody liked them, it would be one thing, but whenever we played live, we always did real well, so I knew if the record was out there, it would sell. That's what was discouraging to me, to be at the mercy of these people who just didn't have any sense. My feeling was that they just didn't realize what they had." The band were very busy throughout 1969, touring Canada, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Texas, California, and Oregon. According to Mo, Steve was going to the MGM offices every day to use their phone for booking concerts here, there, and everywhere, in order to keep money coming in and try to get the album selling to a wider audience. The band were just about covering expenses, paying their rent, and variably making a little pocket money. But equally, they were often scraping by with as little as $2 a day to eat with. They weren't ready to give up by any means, but the grind was tough and morale was low.
Hi, I'm Stoney Burns of Notes, and this is Sterling Morrison of the Velvet Underground. How are you today, Sterling?
Fine. Very nice and warm.
This is anti-war rally here in White Rock. I understand you played a lot of benefits in New York.
Yeah, we've done a lot of benefits. Not anything of a, for an anti-war thing. We've attended, these, giant rallies in the park. I would say this is the way it should be. It's a really nice day, and people playing music, and, pacifistic. I think so too. Here we go again.
The album was successful from our viewpoint in that it was being played on the radio on the FM stations, not all, but you know, a lot of them, and it received very good critical reviews. It wasn't, you know, making us world famous and you know, big stars, but rock and roll was different then. It was less about that and more about being there and doing it, you know, and so it never occurred to me that it wasn't achieving at least many of the goals that we wanted to do. Looking back, it would have been nice if it had made some money too, but a lot of that was eaten up by our touring, you know. A lot of our touring expenses were offset by record royalties, and then Sesnick basically took the rest. I think he couldn't get any more money out of MGM, because for a long time he was charging our expenses to MGM, and he was flying first class. I mean, you know, and we all were flying first class. And the MGM finally realized that this group wasn't making a lot of money, and so they weren't going to get this money back, and kind of balked at the whole thing. So we moved to Atlantic.
According to Mo, Sterling stormed up to Steve's apartment on East 62nd Street and demanded to see the books. He had a nice apartment, but no furniture, exactly the same as Lou, whose East 60s apartment Sterling also visited to find almost totally empty.
He had a tape recorder, some old tapes, a notebook, and an acoustic guitar. There was nothing in the fridge except a half-empty container of papaya juice. I mean nothing, not even vitamins. It was just the picture of isolation and despair.
Maureen had also been living in a nice apartment on University Place and 9th Street, the best of the bunch according to Sterling, but eventually she could no longer afford it and had to move back home with her parents. Despite Steve's constant efforts to push the new album and implore MGM to elevate the band, while it did result in their graduation from their initial Verve deal to another 2-album contract on the parent label, the uninspired promotion and distribution efforts had caused the relationship between the band and label to completely deteriorate. The label were by now restructuring and dropping bands that didn't make much money, so they were ready to let the Velvets go if they wanted. During the time between the third album's release in 1969 and their move to Atlantic in early 1970, which Steve had been negotiating for some time with Ahmet Ertegun, the band had been recording lots of new material outside touring towards a fourth album. But despite an otherwise amicable severance, MGM would not simply hand the material over. With no money to negotiate, the band had no choice but to scrap everything and start again from scratch with Atlantic.
We said to hell with it. That's the stuff Lou drew on when he went solo. Nearly everything on his first album was just a reworking of stuff he'd already done.
By the spring of 1970, after a few months of touring and recording some initial demos for Loaded, Maureen had to temporarily stop working with the group as a result of becoming pregnant, which made it impossible for her to reach the drums. Doug played drums on the final album, as well as session musicians Tommy Castanero, Adrian Barber, and Doug's own brother Billy Yule, who was also hired to cover Mo's absence during the band's legendary 10-week stint at Max's Kansas City starting in June, which was the first time they had played in Manhattan since their attempt to revive the EPI at the Gymnasium back in the spring of 1967. Sterling decided to resume his studies at City College in order to earn his degree after withdrawing without graduating back in 1966, and now spent most of his time reading Victorian novels in the dressing room. He played on every Loaded album track except I Found a Reason, but his commitments to school and playing Max's didn't leave him much time. He chose not to hang around until 6 a.m. while Lou and Doug discussed all sorts of possible combinations of ideas they could employ on the record.
There was a session at Atlantic. This was at the very end, the tail end of the band. Sterling was very grumpy, and we were out on the lawn just to get out of there for a while. I forget what the tension was about, but there was always tension. I just remember walking to the offices of the recording company and taking a nap on somebody's executive couch, and I watched them through the glass.
Loaded was fragmented, and you can hear it in there. It's kind of pieced together, and you know, Maureen wasn't in it, and Sterling stopped coming after a while, and then he started coming. And I understand completely now. I didn't really know much then. He was, must have been very frustrating for him to just sit in the control room for hours, while some little part was, thrashed out, and something he wasn't doing. The recording wasn't done as a band, and the album that I did, that Sesnick released as the Velvet Underground Squeeze, was the same thing. It wasn't done as a band. I don't like it for that reason. It's just something about the synergy of having four people working together that is greater than the sum of all the parts, which of course is what synergy means, right?
Mo's absence made it weird, and when I found out that we were going to be in New York all summer playing and making the album, I thought it was time to finish my few missing credits at City College and graduate, which took me out of the picture too. I had quit smoking, quit taking drugs, and spent my days playing basketball and doing schoolwork. At night I would pedal over to Max's from my place on Christopher Street, play, with some enthusiasm I think, have a cheeseburger and 2 ales after the show, lock my guitar up on the 3rd floor next to the safe, and pedal home, an orderly life. We were always anti-performers, and Lou was leaping around and making all those gestures he does now. I didn't realize it until Lou told me later on, but Sesnick had often exhorted us all to be more dynamic on stage. I guess he had been working on Lou in particular. We were in a bind, though, and so were a lot of other bands. The problem was caused by the gradual disappearance of the old ballrooms, starting around 1969 or so. The old Boston Tea Party, the Avalon, and similar rooms all over began closing up. And these rooms we had always considered to be best for us, holding 1,500 people or thereabouts. We were left with 2 choices: small clubs, which in fact were too small for us and couldn't pay enough, or huge coliseums, which we couldn't fill on our own. With the latter came the real problem, for on those huge stages you would be completely lost unless something theatrical were added to the music. It was no longer enough just to stand there and play the songs. The response of other bands is apparent, the pyrotechnics used by The Who and Kiss, and the truckloads of laser lights and other gimcracks carried around by Wings. Ironically, the wisest course for us in 1970 was probably to revive the EPI, only bigger and better. Loaded into a few 18-wheelers and set out once again across the Hudson. Had that notion occurred to us, which it didn't, I don't think we could have afforded to do it. The one big mistake we made was not playing Europe, where we might have found a more receptive audience.
Lou Reed recalled, "There were a lot of things going on that summer, internally within the band, the situation, and especially the management. Situations which could only be solved by as abrupt a departure as possible once I had made the decision. I just walked out because we didn't have any money, I didn't want to tour again, I can't get any writing done on tour and the grind is terrible, and I wondered for a long time if we were ever going to be accepted on a large scale. Words can't do justice the way I got worked over with the money, but I'm not a businessman. I've always said I don't care about it, and generally I've gotten fucked as a result of that attitude."
Lou was relying totally on Sesnick, but Sesnick felt Lou was too hard to handle and finally told him, "I don't care if you live or die." Lou couldn't face this. It was like a hard divorce, to be very suddenly slapped in the face by someone you trusted. One night I'm sitting in a booth upstairs at Max's eating a cheeseburger, and Lou comes and says, "Sterling, I'd like you to meet my parents." I was astonished. Lou always had an extremely troubled relationship with his parents. They hated the fact that Lou was playing music and hanging around with undesirables. I was always afraid of them seizing Lou and having him thrown into the nut house. That was always over our heads. Every time Lou got hepatitis, his parents were waiting to seize him up and lock him up. So I was thinking, what in the world can this pretend? A day or two after, our manager came and told me that Lou had quit the band and gone back to Long Island with his parents. Everyone had been beaten. We'd all lost on every possible level. In 65 and 66, even in 68, you could feel that something was about to happen. By now it had happened, and the merchandisers had gotten rich. We were all shucked, hyped, screwed. I had hardly spoken to Lou in months. I was so mad at him for real or imaginary offenses, and I just didn't want to talk. Maybe I never forgave him for wanting Cale out of the band. You know that poem, A Poison Tree by Blake? I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. Like that. So in his last days with the group, I was zero psychological assistance to Lou. We finished the week at Max's without him.
I was expecting him to turn up. I thought he was late. Sesnick had engineered, essentially, Lou's leaving the group. I wasn't there, but my understanding is he basically set it up, and when he decided that he didn't want to deal with Lou anymore, he just said, screw you, and Lou quit. And then Sesnick just carried on. He, kept the band going. It took a long time for everything to come out, to understand how it went down like that.
Loaded was released in September 1970 on Atlantic's subsidiary label Cotillion. Lou's name was listed third on the credits below Doug and Sterling, and the whole group was credited for authorship of all of the songs, a matter which was cleared up later when Reed sued and was then granted full rights to all of the material.
The album credit listing was a Sesnickism. Lou was out of the band, so why feature him? It was a pretty shabby ploy. People have complained about that picture too. You look for a picture of the band and, lo and behold, there's a picture of Dougie. But I actually like the picture. You see everybody's amplifiers, but you don't see the people. We signed a 2-record deal with Atlantic, so we delivered Loaded, which is a very good album. Everybody liked it. That record won us the Edison Award in '71, Best Rock and Roll Album. We were horrified about the fact that they weren't making it available. It was getting airplay, but was not in the stores. We were so furious with Ahmet that when he said we should go out on the road, we told him to start the promotion and distribution first. Then we will tour. He said no. So we went skiing and did that the whole winter. Meanwhile, Ahmet is in New York raging. We were mad too. We had this great album that was going no place because it wasn't being pushed or distributed, worse than MGM, which we never would have thought possible. We told Ahmet we didn't like what happened with Loaded, so we're not going to make a second album. So Ahmet comes back a week or two later and says he's bought this tape from Bridget Berlin for $2,000, one of our performances at Max's. I said, hell no, it's something done on a cassette recorder. He claimed he was going to release that tape as our second album unless we all got our asses in the studio. So we said if he was crazy enough to release a cassette tape as an album, go ahead, and he released it. That record should only be understood as an attempt by Ahmet Ertegun to punish us. Atlantic did not release it because it was good. They released it because they wanted to screw us for not wanting to go back into the studio. That constituted the second album, and we avoided breach of contract, which was the club that Ahmet was holding over our heads. But that's never an album I've taken pride in.
Well, Lou suggested after he left that he and I pick it up and start all over with a different manager and get back to the way it was at the beginning. The way it was at the beginning wasn't going to include Cale. We weren't going that far back, apparently. I don't know why I didn't do it. I was pretty soured on pop music in general at the time. And I was mad at Lou for who knows what all, but I hadn't been very friendly to him for the preceding couple of months. And Lou, at the time, accepted responsibility for that. Said it was his fault because he was on these crazy diets and things. I don't know, I just thought that perhaps we accomplished enough that to start all over would be to start rolling the rock uphill again. I know one of the lines I used to Lou was that it would take us 3 years to get back to the point that we were at right the minute we were talking. I said, if we do all these things, just to get back to where we are, would take, I was picking a number, 3 years, maybe I said 2 years. But, and then there was no certainty that we would do it anyway. So, I don't know, I'd kind of decided to go back to school, get away from all that sort of thing. I was pretty disillusioned.
George Nardo, with whom Billy Yule had played in a previous band, filled in temporarily on bass for the last few shows at Max's, and later when Maureen Tucker resumed her duties on drums, Walter Powers, who played in Doug Yule's previous band, was recruited on bass, and Doug switched to lead guitar and vocals. Maureen Tucker recalled, "We picked up Walter and practiced for a while and went out. We did nicely with them. I thought we sounded good. Our major problem was that we didn't have any writing talent." Doug wrote some songs, but not like Lou, and Sterling started becoming disinterested. "I was trying to make it work, but at that point, it was just a band. It was more fun to go play in Boston than get a job in a local office, so I hung around for a while." Meanwhile, Sterling finally completed his undergraduate degree at the City College of New York, and when the band visited Houston, Texas in August 1971, he was contacted by the English department of the University of Texas in Austin and offered a position as a teaching assistant that he had previously applied for. He decided to relocate and accept the job, and meanwhile pursue his PhD in medieval literature. After their last show in Houston, he travelled to the airport with the rest of the band, even bringing along an empty suitcase with him. But just before the plane boarded, to the stunned surprise of his bandmates, he announced he was quitting and staying behind in Texas. Maureen was devastated and later told Martha that it was like being stabbed in the heart by him. She later recalled, "When Sterling left, we had already booked a tour in Europe. I didn't want to go. There was me and these 3 guys. Signs were put up saying the Velvet Underground, and that pissed me off. I went for 2 reasons. I always wanted to go to Europe, so that was a dream come true. And I really felt what a rip-off to have the name in the papers, and there wouldn't have even been one Velvet there. I liked the music the 4 of us played and our renditions of songs, but it wasn't the Velvets."
We were working on new songs, and we sounded very good. But when I looked at myself, I was seeing a professional musician, which I never really set out to be. There wasn't the old excitement, the feeling of crusading. Lou always wanted a pop success, and I think it's always eluded him. His reputation is very high, but it's not based on any particular song that he's done himself. It's hard to do things by yourself. You hire people to play, and they pretty much do what you tell them. You get all the credit, but you never get the criticism. It's not the things he's done solo that have impressed people, but the stuff we all did together. You look at all those Lou Reed picture books and see this creature transformed every 6 months into something else. Now it has blonde hair. Now it has painted nails. Now this and that. Not because Lou feels like being that creature. Lou likes to look like Lou, as far back as I've known him. That is a person with nice curly hair, usually wears sunglasses, dresses neatly. That's Lou. And then there's these other aberrations, Lou trying to adapt himself to this or that market. If he had shown up like that in the Velvet Underground, he would have been subjected to ridicule. He obviously decided that whatever he was going to do, he was going to succeed in music. I always felt I didn't care if I didn't. I'd do something else. Wisely, perhaps. It was fun. It was not Mein Kampf, my struggle. It was a good time. When it became no fun, then I didn't want to do it.
There is a difference between the Velvet Underground that was happening when it was happening and the historical Velvet Underground. Anytime you look back on something, it looks different than when you're in the middle of it. The center of the universe was rock and roll. You know, it was what was happening. It was where it was happening, and it was where the social commentary was. There was no other place to be, you know, except to be doing that. And now you look back and people analyze it, and the band was a sort of an odd combination of people with different strengths that complemented each other in different ways. Both the original group and the second group, you know, the second Velvet Underground. I can't explain why it was so influential. It's totally a mystery to me. It just confused. It eludes me because it was just a band. It was just a lot of fun, and we had, you know, it was amazing that it was going on at the time, because we were all saying like, wow, people are paying us money to do the thing we'd be wanting to do anyway, you know, even if we weren't making any money. And then we look back and saw that we really weren't making any money, that someone else was. But it's a complete mystery to me. You know.
We moved to Austin. Guitars were under the bed. We had no phone, no money, And he totally withdrew from all of that because he was mad that John got thrown out and got this job as a teaching assistant at the University of Texas. I followed him down there and we got married. And he made some friends, of course, and had a band called the Bizarros. Actually, the Bizarros were already formed, and they invited Sterling to join. And so we used to go out. They played in bars and dance, and he got to play. Bizarros were great. They lots of fun, good friends. So he had that, and the friends he made were all interested in music. That's probably why they made their way to our door. People found him, and they played together. Big beer parties every week. Lots of parties in that English department. All great fun. He was a good teacher, and he knew it. The professors knew it, and that was very successful.
I first met Sterling Morrison on a sweltering August afternoon in '75 at the Cedar Door Bar in Austin. He was hiding out from his job as a teaching assistant at the University of Texas, where he was working on his PhD, using his first name Holmes so as not to be distracted by any Velvet Underground acolytes. I barely recognized Sterling that day. He had a big Fu Manchu mustache, which was a good disguise. But once I heard his New York accent and extreme disdain for a variety of rock bands he was talking about, I instantly snapped and asked him, "Are you Sterling Morrison?" He gave me a questionable look and said, "Who wants to know?" The next few years, Sterling and I became sidekicks, the kind of friend you make only a few times in life. He was smart as a whip, funny in a full-tilt East Coast caustic way, and never short with words. Looking back now, it feels like Sterling was waiting for someone to bring him back into the public's view again. It wasn't long before I had convinced the guitarist to join our bar band, the Bizarros, which is where things really went into overdrive. Sterling loved playing guitar, would always be the first to arrive at our rehearsals or jobs. He'd plug in his big Gibson 335 electric guitar, and I could hear him strumming alone the chords of Sweet Jane or any of the other VU stalwart songs, with the most contented look on his face, like those songs were his children. Unfortunately, it was too good to last. I had a really painful falling out with Sterling, and I want to be specific about it so I don't portray him wrong. The Bizarros guitarists decided they wanted to replace Sterling with a bluesier player. I was against it, but we had a band vote, and I lost. And as the band's drummer, I was told to stay out of the guitar department. So I did, and I still regret it. Being the man of steel he was, though, Sterling didn't speak to me for the next dozen years. He ended up working on tugboats in the Houston Ship Channel and eventually got his captain's license. I think that's not what he was meant to do with his life, but that's how it ended up. Sometimes life is odd that way.
Him and my brother both worked on the ferry on Long Island, so they were into that. They both had that interest. And, of course, the main thing was it was good money. He made captain. He told me that the pilots of the ships used to say, when he needed to be guided to the ship canal, "Send me the professor." He never crashed into the dock. He got safety awards. He was good at it. When he was home in Poughkeepsie, every time we had to go in opposite directions in the kitchen, he would crash into me. I said, "What's going on here, Sterling? You keep bumping into me." And he said, "I'm embarrassed to tell you why." He says, "Ever since I made captain, when I walk down the gangway, everybody ducks back into their rooms. I don't even have to think about it. I was supposed to duck out of the way."
Following the punk movement in the late 1970s, which the band had irrefutably influenced, the Velvet's music went through a significant resurgence, and in 1986, all of their MGM albums were remastered and reissued on vinyl, cassette, and for the first time on CD by Polydor, since their parent company Polygram had acquired MGM back in 1972. To coincide with the reissues, London Weekend Television broadcast an hour-long South Bank Show documentary about the band, presented by Melvyn Bragg. The documentary contained interviews with all members of the band, except for Doug Yule, whose name wasn't mentioned once, shamefully, but also revealed several excerpts of period footage of the band, which prior to then had never been seen by the general public.
Tonight on the South Bank Show, the story of the Velvet Underground, which has been described as the most influential rock group of the 60s. They played together for only 4 years, 1966 to 1970, and made only 4 albums during that time. They never played outside America. But the Velvet Underground introduced a rough edge of street realism and doubt into pop music at a time when most bands were still caught up in West Coast flower power, especially poppy power. Without them, it's probably fair to say that punk wouldn't have happened. Their influence is acknowledged by people as diverse as David Bowie, Talking Heads, and the Young Jesus and Mary chain. 17 years after they broke up, their songs are still widely recorded, and this week Polydor are re-releasing all their albums. Together they created the first alliance between pop music and the avant-garde. Perhaps it could only have happened in the 60s, when the emergence of pop art and underground cinema caused an explosion in the established art world. Maybe a big pop rather than a big bang, but impact it had.
Record royalty payments to the band increased for the first time since the albums came out, back when all of their royalty payments were eaten up by recording and touring expenses. Meanwhile, that same year, Sterling completed his PhD in medieval studies after publishing a 628-page dissertation titled Historiographical Perspectives in the Signed Poems of Kinewolf.
School has been a considerable distraction, but that's over. It's nice not to have any regrets beyond, maybe you could have made more money. If I had, I would have spent it anyway. So making money now is like deferred money from back then.
I mean, all these people talk about, how they see the influence in this and that and that. It's like the kiss of death, I would imagine. There's a cult following here for the Velvet Underground, and anybody would want to say, to the record company, if they wanted to get signed, that they were influenced by the Velvet Underground would be stupid. The last thing you would want a record company to feel was they were dealing with another Velvet Underground.
I had put out a little single, and that's when I found out what was going on as far as young fans and stuff. And then when I was selling my little single over the phone, I just, in my kitchen, calling up record shops around the country, I had my little speech all set. I was going to say, my name is Maureen Tucker, and I used to be in the Velvet Underground, figuring they wouldn't know who this was. And not one of them did I get to Velvet Underground. As soon as I said Maureen Tucker, they knew who I was, and that really surprised me.
We've all really gone our separate ways, and I have no communication with any of them except Maureen, Mo, the drummer. I'm not interested in reunions at all. I like today, what's going on today, and I think it's nice what happened yesterday. I'm very proud of it all, but I wouldn't want to go back.
Musically, things started heating up again for Sterling in the late 80s, as he began playing with Mo's solo band, and after he and Martha moved back up to New York, the Fondation Cartier Museum organised a Warhol retrospective event in Paris, which they attended along with Mo, John and Lou.
I went as Lou Reed's publicist. When I first met Reed in 1988, he knew I had been friends with Sterling and immediately took me aside to say, let's get this straight. Sterling remembers everything and I remember nothing. Got it? Fine, I said to Lou, and never forgot that was our agreement, so did not talk about Sterling around him too much. In Paris, I saw Sterling across the hotel room when I got there and walked over to him. He couldn't resist saying to me, what happened to you, Bentley? You ended up at record company flack? Pathetic. That was Sterling. He had to throw a fastball at my head. What the hell, Sterling, I shot back. What in the world did I ever do to you? He gave me the cold shoulder for a while, but then he said, you got me into the Bizarros and it was your job to keep me in. I tried explaining that I was outvoted. He wouldn't hear of it. I think some of those old wounds had come from when he had to tell John Cale that he was out of the Velvets and was probably still ashamed of doing that. Like it was his responsibility to keep John in the band. But in the beauty of those few days in Paris, it was an incredible thing to see him warm up and in the end become my friend again. It felt like a gorgeous gift I'd been giving for never giving up on someday reuniting with Sterling. When it happened, it felt like absolution for me.
We were just looking at all the posters and things, and there was a stage set up. I don't know if there was another band or not. It was an outdoor event.
The exhibit, I really find it sort of makes me a bit twitchy. I'm not ready for museums yet.
Well, it's the first time that the four of us have been in one room since the late 60s, in the absence of legal representatives and things.
The Velvet Underground came together in New York City in 1965, and over the course of the next 5 years and 4 albums, they made wild, noisy art out of songs about drugs and depravity and love and, yes, even Jesus. They never quite fit into the hippie peace and love period, though, and not many people bought their records, but echoes of their inimitable work can still be heard in alternative music today.
Naturally, the kinds of things we were doing that were considered so weird and revolutionary don't seem so weird and revolutionary now. That's a good thing.
We have a little surprise for you.
All of a sudden, I saw 1 or 2 of them on stage. And then Sterling came over. I was standing there with my old friend Linda, our old friend Linda. And he said, "We're going to play, but I have to wash my hands." And Linda had a napkin and some Perrier. And they went up there and they played for the first time together in 30 years or whatever it was. And I thought I was going to faint. I just fell down on the grass. I've got a picture of Sterling and Lou together with, Sterling's arm around Lou. He's taller. That's probably how it went. Talking together. And the next day, I was talking to Sylvia Reed. And she said, "I haven't seen Lou in such a good mood in years." Everything was lightened up. They were very relieved. Yeah, it was very good for everyone, especially them. Have a happy day.
I'd like to introduce Sterling Morrison. And Maureen Tucker. Death of me. Rowing, it's my wife and it's my life.
That was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my few years on Earth. It was extraordinary. I moved up right into the pocket between you and John Esterl. Holy.
And do you think that's the last time we'll see the Velvets ever play together?
Hope not. Never know.
Arrive at here, winners in my bed, and that boy is in my head. Thank God I'm good is good. Thank God I'm not aware. Thank God I just don't care.
Following the Cartier event in 1990, Maureen opened a few shows for Lou Reed's tour in August, and the following year, Sterling, John and Lou all contributed towards her new album, I Spent a Week There the Other Night. Friendships were clearly renewing, and in 1992 when Sterling toured with Maureen's band, at one point they were joined on stage by Lou. There was much media speculation of a reunion, and as the band were meeting regularly around this time to discuss an upcoming box set release of their entire discography on Polygram, it became a serious consideration. These discussions enabled any old grievances to at least be set aside if not resolved, and Lou Reed, John Cale, Sterling Morrison and Maureen Tucker all decided to meet in New York for a 5-hour rehearsal in early 1993, which turned out to be a success. For the good of the fans who had been buying their records, as well as most importantly, for their own enjoyment, the reunited band committed to a short summer tour of Europe. Doug Yule claims that Sterling Morrison advocated for his inclusion in the tour to fill out the sound and relieve him of bass playing duties. It transpired, however, that only 4 musicians would be on stage during the tour.
Somebody from the record company pointed out to me that, in fact, we didn't sell anything before. And all the shows are filled with young people because the records are selling now, 25 years after the fact. Curious.
The band has great pride. It was pride that kept us apart, but it was also pride that made us do well. Nobody cares about our legacy more than we do. I'd rather die, truly, than betray our basic principles. At the end of the rehearsals, I asked them, look, do we really want to do this? They all said yes, so I went along so as to not be the villain.
What I'm going to do is, play these things live, and there's no way to do it unless I could get the original people. And I think that's what sort of amazed us in Paris. Was how much we actually missed, hearing this stuff all around you.
All of these things add up eventually. The way Maureen plays drums, the way Sterling plays guitar, all of these 4 different talents in the band contribute to what that sound is, and nobody else does it.
Our view of the quality of what we did, I feel we're in an interesting situation where we're all alive to see history validated somehow. Not only us, but Andy's faith in us, and our faith in ourselves, and the integrity that's gone into it, and all these years never to betray it. We have time to point to as the real judge of who or what did what first, best, and always.
Tickets sold out for their opening night at the Playhouse in Edinburgh, a 3,000 capacity venue. They were supported by the band Luna, reportedly because Lou Reed was a fan of their 1992 debut album Luna Park, which was produced by Lou's drummer, Fred Mayer. Dean Wareham, lead guitarist and singer of Luna, recalled,
In 1993, I received a phone call from my manager asking if Luna wanted to open for the Velvet Underground on their upcoming European tour. And I thought maybe she was joking. But a couple of months later, there we were at the Playhouse in Edinburgh, sitting in the dressing room, eating cheese sandwiches and Scotch eggs. We had already recorded a demo version of Friendly Advice with producer Victor Van Butte, which we played every night on that VU tour. And Sterling Morrison told us it was his favorite track. So we asked if he'd like to play guitar on our next album, and were pleasantly surprised when he said yes. As far as we knew, Sterling hadn't played on anyone's record since about 1971.
Several of the dates were support slots for U2, one of the many bands who claimed to have been influenced by the Velvet Underground.
The U2 stadium shows were actually the most comfortable for me. The entire front of the crowd were all U2 fans, staring at us with blank expressions. And way, way back would be our fans, with the bananas and banana balloons, but they were too far back to be heard, so we played to mostly indifference, as in the old days. The tour was sort of fun, but we couldn't have that same casual approach. We'd have to tell the light people the order of the songs, or tell the security people when we'd end. I never used to feel so locked in.
Overall, the tour had a polarizing effect on the audiences and critics. Unanimously, people were elated to finally have the chance to see the by now legendary band on stage, but equally the consensus was that while the musicianship of Sterling Morrison and Maureen Tucker was a revelation, the overall sound of the group was not reflective of their records. Songs that consistently sounded the most familiar were Venus in Furs, Heroin, and All Tomorrow's Parties, but many other songs were changed in key to suit Lou's voice that had naturally deepened with age, and did not sound as chaotic and raw as the originals because the whole band were using much more modern and refined equipment. Lou also made the controversial decision to use totally different, and as some described it, goofy vocal phrasing on many of the songs, which took away from the enjoyment of the music that was otherwise very faithful to the band's original sound. They played shows in the UK, Netherlands, Germany, Czech Republic, France, Switzerland, Denmark, and Italy.
I was finding my seat, and the entire stadium was yelling for Sterling, and I said, yeah, that's what I've been waiting for. In Europe, it was much different. They're recognized walking down the street in Wales.
The days of the tour were numbered, however, as both old and new tensions arose. On stage at the Glastonbury Festival in the UK, after Lou had a technical issue with his guitar multi-effects pedal just before the song Some Kind of Love,
That'll do. Just leave it. Leave it. Leave it.
after the song was over and the stagehand had changed Lou's guitar and swapped Sterling to bass, Sterling walked over to confront Lou with some emphatically expressed words off mic before returning back to his spot. Lou shouted back at him in outrage and stood in shock for a moment before looking to the others for support, in vain. He quickly swallowed what was probably the first onstage criticism he'd received in a quarter century, and they proceeded with the song All Tomorrow's Parties. But this incident, along with the already existing creative differences between Lou and John on the subject of who was to produce the live album recording that had been proposed, had essentially doomed the reunion. Plans for a new studio album and USA tour were scrapped, and all members resumed their separate lives.
I was a little surprised when the band broke up again, because they seemed to be getting along well on tour, but then again, no one on the outside really knows what's going on inside a band.
They invited Sterling to play on one of their albums as their guitar legend. We all laughed, but it was really true. And he said to me around that time, he said, maybe they'll ask me to join the group. So he was still up for it and ready for more. But, you know, he just plain got sick.
In 1994, Sterling performed on 5 tracks on Moe's new album, Dogs Under Stress. In November, John, Sterling and Moe joined together to perform music to accompany the screening of Andy Warhol's films Eat and Kiss at the recently opened Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. At rehearsals, it became obvious that Sterling was seriously ill, as he was unable to sit or stand for long periods. Maureen Tucker recalled, "We knew something was wrong, but we had no idea it was terminal, for God's sake. I had seen him a month before the museum show, and the difference in his physical appearance was shocking. I never contemplated the cause. He was older and wiser, gave up smoking, jogged, always popping vitamins. I'd laugh at him and say, 'Stel, put that shit down, have a cigarette.' He was real proud that he had not become a pot-bellied, dumpy older person, so him getting that sick that quickly was a shock. The last time I saw him was the night before he died. I went up to Poughkeepsie for 5 or 6 days, and I had to go home to my kids. While I was on the train that night, he died." John Cale recalled, "I really didn't understand how much of a problem it was until Martha took him to her GP and the tests came back. I went up to see him after he had some treatments in Buffalo. It was shocking to see. He was very emaciated, but determined to get to play the Eat and Kiss music at a festival in Lille. We were focused on getting Sterling in shape to go to it. As soon as I saw him, I knew there was some serious difficulty. We did the festival without him. When I came back, I got a call that said I better go up and see Sterling. That was the last time I saw him. He was aware of what was around him, but he couldn't communicate very well. I wanted him to know what kind of an influence he'd had on me, so I got a chance to tell him."
When Sterling was sick and dying, Lou came up to the house. Everybody came up. They were okay at the end. He never expressed any discontent or regret. He said to me lying there in bed, he said, "I'm just beginning to hit my stride, Mart." That was tough to hear.
Holmes Sterling Morrison Jr. died one day after his 53rd birthday of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on August 30th, 1995. John and Moe attended the memorial service on September 2nd, but Lou was absent due to attending the first concert for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. He later paid tribute to his friend in the New York Times Magazine, saying the following: "Sterling said the cancer was like leaves in the fall, a perfect Morrison description. He loved the English language. When I asked if he had a guitar to play, he said yes, he did, but he had watched 7, he'd counted, 7 layers of skin peel from his body, and that had made guitar playing and quite a few other things painful. This eye for detail was very much Sterling. In fact, it saved my life once. We were playing in an aeroplane hangar in Los Angeles in 1966. I was standing near a microphone when I heard Sterl call gently but firmly, 'Don't move.' I turned my head just in time to see smoke, one of my guitar strings vaporized by the ungrounded microphone it had just touched. I would have been ashes. I arrived at his house by train from the city with depressing thoughts in my head and not one decent suggestion. I was struck by how big he was. Perhaps that was accentuated by the extreme gauntness of his once muscular physique. He was bulk with nothing but skin over his bone. But his eyes were as alert and clear as any eyes I've seen in this world. Not once did he complain. We spoke of music and old bandmates, we talked baseball, we never spoke of what was going on. He was strong despite the illness, but then he'd always been the strongest one. All the questions I had were answered, and all the past differences resolved. And in the extraordinary moments when men transcend their bodies and words are spoken at their own peril, in those moments that move beyond speech and picture, in these moments that only an artist can capture, I saw my friend Sterling, Sterl, the great guitar-playing, tugboat captaining, PhDing professor, raconteur supreme, argumentative, funny, brilliant Sterl as the architect of this monumental effort, possessor of astonishing bravery and dignity, the warrior heart of the Velvet Underground. Further tributes included Doug Yule. Sterling was the one who put the bug in Sesnick's head that eventually pulled me into the group. He was the one who wanted me to join the reunion 25 years later to play the bass. He had a prodigious memory and ability to analyse a situation while he was in it, and he always argued from a rational perspective, rarely an emotional one. He was a very fair if somewhat cantankerous character that I loved more than I knew. Dean Wareham.
He was a lovely and unassuming guy, the only person I know who could talk about Moby Dick and Moby Grape with equal passion and authority. When Sterling passed away, I put on my headphones and I listened to his transcendent guitar solo in Friendly Advice. I do this every year to celebrate his birthday, and it always triggers the emotions in the way that only music can.
Bill Bentley.
Maureen had come to stay with Martha and one day called and said to me, "You better talk to Sterling now." Martha held the phone up to him. He couldn't form words, though. Immediately, my heart felt like it had split in two, and my mind froze into a mass of ice. I told Sterling I loved him and always had, right from that day at the Cedar Door in Austin, 20 years ago when we first met, and how sorry I was it had turned out this way for him. There was silence on the phone for what felt like a lifetime, and then I heard Sterling's voice, hardly recognizable. Once it had been a mountain of strength and total attitude, but now barely he was able to say, "I love you too, Bill." And then the phone clicked off. Holmes Sterling Morrison died later that day. I think of my dear friend almost every day. I wonder why I was given the endless gift of that friendship with him instead of someone else getting it. I often feel like it was some kind of divine intervention for me, even with the bumpy road we had in the middle. Right up to the end, Sterling was a man of strength. Without him, music history would be very different. We spoke when he was back in Houston, and he told me he was writing a book about his years in the band to be called The Velvet Underground Diet. But I don't think he ever wrote a page for that book.
All those diet books go right to the top of the bestseller list. Besides, that title conjures up the ingestion of all sorts of things.
And of course, Maureen Tucker. I have only wonderful memories of Sterling. We had a lot of fun together bullshitting, drinking beer, playing pool. I am so glad he played with me. He was very happy to be back in music. Moe's own son, Richard, was taught how to play guitar by Sterling. Richard would later name his son after him in honour. In 1996, the Velvet Underground were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lou, John, Moe, and Martha Morrison all attended the ceremony. Maureen Tucker recalled, "Well, I was real close to not going to that. They sent us all little letters. It was 6 weeks after Sterling had died, and there was not one word of, 'Gee, we're sorry about Sterling's death.' Nothing, as if it had never happened. Martha called and said, 'Did you get your letter?' She was mad, and I was furious. And then that was quickly followed by Cale calling me, and he said, 'You know, they're going to want us to play at this thing.' And I said, 'How are we going to play? No way.' He said to them, 'Sterling just died.' And they said, 'Well, you can just get a replacement.' This was their knowledge of music. I said to John, 'I don't give a shit what they think. I am not playing, and I'm probably not even going.' And John says, 'Now, Mo.' Later, Lou called and said, 'Mo, how about if we make up a new song, something that Sterling never played on?' And I said, 'Oh, that's an idea. Then it could be a little tribute.' It had just so happened that 2 weeks before, I had started to write lyrics for a song about Sterling. So I faxed that to them, then we got together and they made up the music, and that's the song we did. It's my hope that this documentary tells as many of Sterling's recollections that were written down over the years to as many people as possible. It's my hope that when listening to the music of the Velvet Underground, nobody forgets to picture him, standing tall in the background, away from the spotlight, playing his guitar, and smiling to himself knowingly. How do you believe that Holmes Sterling Morrison would feel knowing that his musicianship is still revered and celebrated more than 50 years after his major contributions ended?
I don't think he would be surprised, just hugely pleased and happy.
I like Victor Bacchus and Gerard Malanga's book, and am impressed by the scope of it. What I would change, and clearly which cannot be changed, is the overall tone of the work, starting with uptight in the title, and proceeding to recount the disintegration of first the show, EPI, and then of the band. It becomes a chronicle of doom, sort of. What has been buried is the laughter and happiness that attended all of this, the jokes, the parties, the zany adventures. We were serious about what we did, but not grim, very often. I'm probably picturing something other than a factual account of what went on, and what happened after. I suspect that my main fear concerns my final comment about the experience being fun. In the light of all that is described, my comment seems insensitive and shallow. Nevertheless, as serious as I was as a crusader, I had no desire to be a martyr. The fun and enjoyment of the people and things we were caught up in sustained me in no small measure. I was having, shall we say, the time of my life, and I savored it, knowing full well it couldn't last. In fact, exploding, plastic, and inevitable sum it all up from an apocalyptic perspective. The origin of the universe and its contents, the mutability of form, and the inescapable decline, entropy, the end. Against this backdrop, how can a handful of artists, dancers, and musicians hope to fare any better? Doug Yule was a good bass player, but we moved more towards unanimity. Unanimity. Who the fuck says that? Let's start again. But we moved towards This guy's brilliant. He's brilliant. That's why he talks like this.
nickels in my pocket. You know I get me some more. Hey, I'm not a young man anymore. Hey, I'm not a young man anymore. I got 5 nickels in my pocket. You know I get me some more. Nickels in my pocket, you know I get me some more. Hey, I'm not a young man anymore. Hey, I'm not a young man anymore. I got 5 nickels in my pocket, you know I get me some more.